Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on the latest season of Big Brother US BB24, which is a season that had massive highs and massive lows, going from having one of the worst starts to any season ever, only to giving us one of the best weeks in the history of the show, and from that point forward, ending up being a rocky road that, despite some stagnation in gameplay, you would see something crazy pretty much happen every week that would shake things up. But despite that, I will be honest, I still struggled to care for a lot of the season, and part of that comes from the fact that I just did not like this cast that much right from the beginning. And while the earlier shift in the game dynamics did make some of the cast seem a bit more likable, I still never found the gameplay that interesting outside of a few rounds, and didn't find this group of players to really be that great strategically either. So those are aspects of the season that really held it down for me. But I do think there's also fascinating aspects of this season that I do think will make this an important season moving forward, feeling like a contrast but also a continuation to BB23 at the same time, that I do think will affect the way that people play the game moving forward. One that obviously has a very satisfying conclusion, both from a storyline standpoint and also a historic standpoint as well, that I do think by the end of it kind of rectifies a lot of my more glaring issues with the season, where I think when you look at the season as a whole, it definitely feels a lot better now knowing the outcome, than it does if you look at its individual parts, which through that, it does leave this as one of the best modern day seasons of Big Brother US, despite my shortcomings with it. But with that, like my other reviews, I will be running through the season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, where we do get another live move-in, which leads to another mediocre premiere of it just being filled with intros and dumb competitions. Though I do feel like it is a sacrifice worth making for us to be getting night one feeds. But through that obviously leads to a mediocre start to the season. But here we do have the players entering in their typical groups of 4, where after entering they have to find a ticket within the house, which will determine what competition they are competing in, which does lead to some awkwardness in this situation, where these players are finally getting to talk to their fellow players for the first time, in a position where I feel like they wouldn't care about searching the house to find a ticket. So I don't get why they made them even bother searching the house to find them. Why not just have it right in front of them as they enter and they just pick one out there? But also I found it really funny to see the first group of 4 get all the exact same competition, which made the randomness of this feel kind of off. But again, this ends up determining which of the 3 competitions you participate in, where the winners of these 3 competitions will compete for HOH. Again, another boring format that was made just to fill out time here, but it is where we do learn that the season is festival themed, with this being BB Fest, which was really dumb. But here with 16 players, 1 player will not be picked for a competition, and instead be declared the backstage boss, the first major twist of the season, and a terrible one at that, starting what ends up being a pretty terrible season from a production standpoint, with a season containing some really terrible twists, and also them making some pretty questionable decisions along the way. But the backstage boss twist here doesn't even end up coming to be, though even if it had, while I do think it would have produced a favorable result for the season, it is something that goes against the format of the show, and potentially having someone eliminated without formally getting to play the game. Now, obviously, we've seen worse versions of this in the day 1 evictions of Glenn or David, but that doesn't make this a good twist, just a better version of an all-time worst twist, where here we do get to see Pooch get the backstage boss pass, becoming safe for the week, but in doing so also has the power to instantly pick 3 people to join him backstage, which will put them in danger to leave, though also leaves them immune from the events of the main game. In here, we do see him pick the last place finishers in the 3 competitions, which is the obvious way to get out of this with the least amount of blood in your hands, so he picks Alyssa and Paloma, but one of the comps doesn't have an easy person to pick, so he ends up picking Brittany, which earns him some ire anyway. But also here we do learn that America will vote to save one of them, and then we would have seen Pooch vote one of the other 2 to face off against the voted out player from this round, again, making a competition determine who stays in the game. And again, a lot of this just feels unfair to the player sent backstage here, especially considering the fact that the players weren't told what was going on through most of the week, meaning that they wouldn't have been able to strategize around it, essentially making one of these players potentially doomed by a decision made before these players even got to know each other. Obviously making this decision based off first impressions, and also basing the entirety of their run on the season around competition wins, which is just a format I don't personally like. But again, we do have 3 competitions to determine who is HOH, the first being a Q&A with the players being in porta potties and being dunked in blue paint when they lose, which was dumb. The next one is probably the dumbest competition I've ever seen, where they have to put jewelry on their face to match an image, which was ridiculous to watch. The final comp was literally just hanging from a bar, and that was lame. Though there we do see Daniel outlast Michael, giving Michael one of his few genuine comp losses. And we do see Daniel end up winning the final part of the comp as well, making him the first HOH, which, considering his super fandom, you would have expected him to know exactly what to do with this HOH and take control of the game, but instead his HOH reign ends up being largely mediocre, with him being left outside of the core power structure, which is really abnormal for a first HOH, especially when they end up trying to appease the house. But with that, let's get into the rest of week 1, which was just such a bad start to this season, with almost everyone in the house coming off as extremely unlikable over the course of this week, largely due to the treatment of Taylor, who does become the main character of the season, largely because most of the people in the house hated her for seemingly no reason. And this was a situation where, had the feeds not been up since the very beginning, I think most of the fan base would probably be under the assumption that Taylor must have done something wrong to cause this hatred towards her. But us seeing everything since the beginning allowed us to know that Taylor simply just did nothing wrong here, and that the likes of Paloma and Jasmine just hated her right away. And we even see one of the first conversations on the feeds being one that involves Paloma talking about already not liking her, not based on anything she had done in the game, and just based off of first impressions and initial biases, which, after getting to know Taylor more, those impressions obviously end up being wrong. And through this week, she ends up villainizing everything Taylor did, and with Paloma also being the most active player on the board, it left her influence here to be really effective in turning the entire house against Taylor. Even figures who had initially come off as just as confused as the audience as to why they hated her were eventually convinced to hate her as well, with the most notable of which being Daniel and Nicole, who are now looked at as some of the biggest anti-Taylor figures, despite the fact that they were actually one of the few pro-Taylor figures very early on this season. And this unfair treatment of Taylor and how effective the snowpiling on her was, to which it eventually made her the target for this first week, was pretty unbearable to watch. But it is also this unfair treatment and the fact that she ends up surviving beyond this that does end up making her a focal character for the show, despite them initially trying to cover this up in the edit, showing sequences that happen after the likes of Paloma and Jasmine had already voiced their dislike of her, but showing them out of order to make these moments like her playing pool with the guys and her showing off her dresses as reasons for their hatred, when again there weren't any in-game reasons. But again, Paloma was just all over this week, where not only was she the most prominent figure in turning the house against Taylor, but she was also the center of all the alliances in the first week, with her seemingly playing without fear here, in a situation where it did seem like Frenchie's terrible HOH reign from last season seemed to have a major impact in how the players were worried about overplaying in this season, where we don't see many alliances forming in the early days of this season, with Paloma being one of the few to play aggressively here, partially seemingly due to the fact that she was involved in the backstage boss twist, which left her safe from the reign of the HOH, humorously being an anti-Daniel figure while in the house, despite the fact that Daniel thought they were extremely close. But here we do see her instantly form a final 2 with Alyssa, which leads to this ridiculous scene of Paloma hiding behind the bed to make sure that no one sees them talking, despite how obvious it was that the two of them were going to be close here. We also see her form the Girls-Girls Alliance, which essentially was just made here to leave out Taylor, it being an all-girls alliance that didn't include Taylor and Nicole because they weren't girls, which just felt ridiculous. But the show tries to act as if this was a real alliance that was running the game early on, when in reality they were barely a thing by the end of week 1, where we even see Brittany ratting out Amira to Pooch, with Pooch eventually becoming the target for the very next round by the end of the week. But she does this to protect herself in the case that Pooch has more power with the backstage boss, which is a good thought to think, but she hadn't built any trust with him beforehand, so this obviously leads to Pooch not believing this and ratting her out to Amira, essentially kicking Brittany out of the alliance there. Even beyond that, the Girls was mostly an afterthought to the other alliance ends up forming here, where we see what ends up becoming the true majority alliance early on, with Paloma making an alliance with some of the stronger guys in Monty, Kyle, and originally Pooch, though finally they swap him out for Michael without telling him. And his bringing in of Michael to the alliance felt very Devin-esque, with Michael being added before even letting most of the other members of the alliance know, and also making it clear to him that he is on the bottom of this alliance. And really, Paloma's gameplay style did feel in line with someone like a Devin, someone that is so aggressive in the game, to the point where they gain some control short term, but eventually their own alliance will get annoyed by their antics and lead to them being public enemy number one. That's what I expected from the Paloma run here, but then we obviously get her bizarre exit. But it did put Paloma in this center position in the house, and this alliance later becomes the pose pack after she ends up leaving, which seemed like an alliance poised to run the entire game. So again, the majority of the house structure throughout the first week here was created by Paloma. And again, all during Daniel's HOH reign. Again, the first HOH is supposed to be the strong position where you get the opportunity to set up the power structure, but Daniel really lets it slip by him, with him ending this week left out of all the big alliances. Now, I will say that I get why he plays passively here, where again, we had just seen Frenchie and he didn't want to repeat his mistakes. And also mixing that in with the other players also wanting to play counter to that as well, it led to the other players not wanting to have game conversations with him in the worry that they would be perceived as playing too hard. So typically, the way Daniel played this first HOH and wanting to hold back a bit and wanting to wait for people to approach him to make deals is something that can be effective in a lot of seasons, but on this particular one, it leads to him being on the outs here. To the point where he even recognizes how no one is approaching him for alliances, though we do see him make a couple alliances along the way, the most important of which being his relationship with Nicole, where they bond instantly and become the Rugrats, a duo that seemed like a discount version of Tyler and Casey. And while at first I thought that this could be an interesting duo with them being two pretty competent players at this point that were left outside of the core power structure, obviously being some of the least likable figures across this season. But we also see Daniel bond with Amira, who in the early game here did come off as one of the most impressive players on the board, being one of the only players to approach Daniel here and talk game with him, while also being part of both the girls and the pose pack. And while she was a bit loose with information and was being targeted by some of the guys, she did instantly come off as a power player here and did get a big edit with them leaning on her to talk about the strategic maneuverings of the majority alliance. But beyond this, Daniel does end up having some strange noms that aren't even properly explained on the show, where he decides to target Michael, which he claims is because he's a super fan, when Daniel is also a super fan, which felt like something that they could have bonded over instead of targeting him for, so I don't get why he decided to do that. Also, he ends up using Terrence as a pawn, a person that he instantly bonded with on night one, and had claimed that there was no way he was going to nominate him, so the fact that he does here was also very questionable to me. And again, it just seemed to be a move they made to appease the house, but doesn't end up actually gaining him any favor here. And we do see Michael winning his first veto here, making Daniel have to find another target, which is where we see that despite Taylor being hated by most of the women, they aren't actually targeting her in this position, with them actually wanting a bigger guy to be booted here, with the house initially seeming to be split naturally across gender lines, with the more bro-y guys coming together, which ends up being a side alliance for the likes of Kyle and Monty. And we do see the women do some work here in trying to put the target onto Joseph. Though that never ends up going through, there was also a plan to take out Indy at a point as well, but the replacement nom does eventually end up becoming Taylor. But again, not due to the likes of the women that were bashing on her coming for her, but instead it was actually from the guys, where the show doesn't show this, but it was actually Pooch who was the one to convince Daniel to take out Taylor, which did lead to Pooch coming off as extremely unlikable here, especially because of the microaggressions he was using as part of his campaign against her. But this ends up being the only effective work Pooch ends up doing across this season, which wasn't even shown on the show. But instead, we do end up seeing this massive debacle that occurred between Paloma and Monty, where Paloma, in a convo with Taylor, said that she can't work with the guys, which, again, she was lying to Taylor in this situation, but Taylor does take this information to Monty, who takes that back to Paloma, which leads to Paloma once again going and smearing Taylor's name. And this is what the show portrays as the reason why Taylor was going up, when in reality, she was already going up at this point. And Paloma didn't even want Taylor to go here. Paloma was actually campaigning for a guy to go. And again, it was just all really frustrating to see the show really try to portray all this as Taylor's fault, And again, she doesn't do that much wrong here. Though, when we're looking at this from a TV perspective, I do get it, especially with the storytelling being made up of the use of DRs from players that in themselves are deluded in the narratives that they tell themselves. So I get how it can be a struggle to tell this story, as from a storytelling perspective, you do want to explain the why of why things are happening, but really there was no why here. That doesn't make it not frustrating to see these fake narratives exuded here, and also it's just really sad to see Taylor start to realize that she might be going on the block and get emotional when she stems it back to her always having issues with bonding with people, and we follow that up with Daniel just being a dick to her in his nomination speech, saying that she needs to apologize for things she said, which I don't even think he knew the things that she said. Before this round, if it was a normal season, Taylor would have gone home here. I mean, she would have been the first boot, but instead she gets 2 saving graces here. First, in the fact that the backstage boss twist existed in this scenario, where Brittany was going to be saved by America, and with Pooch being closer to Alyssa than Paloma, it would have been likely that we would have had a Taylor-Paloma face-off, where, knowing the competition, Taylor would have smoked her there, meaning that Paloma would have likely been the boot this week anyway. But the way that Paloma does end up leaving here ends up being extremely abnormal, where again it had been clear from watching the feeds that Paloma's mental state was starting to deteriorate, with her saying things that didn't make sense, or coming up with schemes to get everyone to share the money, not getting any sleep, and all this led up to us learning that she has decided to quit the game due to her mental health, and we see everyone in the house take this really hard, but disgustingly, we do also see that this furthers Daniel's hatred of Taylor, with him blaming Taylor for Paloma's quit, which seemed really misguided, but due to Paloma's quit here, the entire backstage twist ends up being scrapped, the eviction is cancelled, and we do get a great reaction from Taylor there, but really most of the eviction episode here ends up being an impromptu change, where we take what would have been the backstage competition of it being this mini obstacle course and turn it into a qualifier for the HOH because we needed to waste time. And this was just ridiculous, though it does lead to some humorous moments, particularly from Julie, as expected from a live show at this point. But the ending of the episode was particularly funny to me, where she tells Monty and Nicole in the final matchup that they're running out of time, and we have her clearly being annoyed as they each fail the course multiple times. And really the big moment here ends up revolving around Jasmine, who does beat Terrence, but this is where we do get Confetti Gate, where she slips at a point, and the controversy is whether or not she should have been DQ'd for touching the ground, and I don't care. Or again, for me, the comps have always been just more so a formality of determining who has the power, but ideally, obviously, it would be fair, but don't really care too much about this controversy. But the other notable moment here comes from after Jasmine had already won, where she ends up tripping off the platform, injuring her ankle, which, while sad for Jasmine, I did feel like this ended up being a really humorous moment for Julie, who seemed to almost call her out for hitting the ground, but then felt bad about it, and later tells Jasmine to celebrate her win while she's laying on the ground injured. And we do later get humor from her talk about faking her injury and this causing some other people to dislike her, and again, all that was pretty fun. So largely, this segment did come off as a waste of time here, but before moving on, I do want to talk about Paloma, who had a really fascinating run on this season, being such a power player early on, and one that really set up the power structure that held until the rise of the leftovers. And she was also such a major presence on the feeds to where it felt like every conversation that was going on, both in and outside the house, were focused around her and Taylor. But again, she does largely come off as unlikable throughout this week due to her treatment of Taylor, and while her game position did seem strong, she's probably going to be a boot in this round anyway due to the backstage boss twist. And even beyond that, I fully expected her game to unravel within the next few weeks anyway, but she was such a massive presence across this first week that losing her did feel like a big loss for the season. But with that brings us to week 2, which starts off with us seeing the ramifications of the Paloma quit, with the pose pack officially forming, with Amira naming it after Paloma, because why not, I guess, but she does take the reins of the alliance, and we do see them add in a new member, once again not informing the entire alliance before actually doing so, but Monty and Amira decide to add Nicole to the alliance, which seemed really idiotic here, with them once again making it clear to her that she was on the bottom of the group and that she was replacing Paloma, and she immediately rats out this alliance to Daniel, and in turn puts Nicole in a really strong position at this point in the game, where at this point she was loved by most of the cast. She had now made inroads with the women that excluded her from the girls initially. She is part of the Pose pack and also has Daniel. So again, she was the best position player in the game at this point, which makes it really humorous how quickly that crumbles moving forward. But also it was really funny to see this actually make Daniel fully recognize how terrible his HOH was, where everyone that he nominated is still in the game, and he's still being left out of all these major alliances. But then we get to the actual HOH comp, which ends up being a pie eating competition, and we have to see them dunk their heads in the pies and bob out an answer to the question, which was just weird. And this comp really just takes up so much time, but it does come down to Jasmine and Michael, where the edit makes it seem like he was trying here, when on the feeds, like, Michael clearly talked about he threw this competition to Jasmine, and it does lead up to a Jasmine HOH win, obviously to some controversy due to Confetti Gate, but Jasmine does initially want to target Taylor to have an easy HOH week, as again, she was on her way out already. And Jasmine was one of the biggest anti-Taylor figures in the house, but this is where Amira really gets propped up in the edit, with her really leading the charge to get Jasmine to target Pooch and Turner instead. And really, after the Paloma quit, Amira becomes the figurehead for her respective alliances, taking Paloma's role in those alliances, which again gave her a lot of control in the game, but still left her as such a blatant target for some of the guys in the game like Pooch, Turner, and Joseph, who weren't in any of her alliances. But this is where Pooch joins the story, where at this point he is so confident that Taylor is the target and is so resolute in taking her out that he comes up with this master plan to backdoor Taylor, and even ends up offering himself up to be a pawn against Brittany, and so confident that he can win the veto to take himself off. And this is all just ridiculous. Again, like, such a misread from Pooch here in not recognizing the fact that people already wanted him gone, even without him offering it up here, with him already being planned to be a potential backdoor target at this point, but instead he just makes it so easy for them to just put him up with no ramifications. And this really ends up being a spectacular downfall for Pooch, with the edit completely dunking him along the way, with his constant talk about how great Big Brother players aren't scared to go on the block, which is never a takeaway I've ever had from this game. But his planned nominations of him and Brittany don't even go through anyway, as Jasmine ends up putting up initially with Taylor, giving Taylor a chance to win veto anyway, and making all this just such a disaster for him. Also, this is the first time we get the mention of the Oasis, the guys alliance that Pooch was in, that, like the girls was not real for most of the people in it, but funnily Pooch is basing his entire game off of this alliance, having his back. But this is also where we get a Pooch-Joseph bromance segment, which felt weird, as him and Joseph, well, they did have a touchy-feely relationship. Pooch's real loyalty was to Turner. To me, it was weird to see that relationship not highlighted here. But coming into the veto comp, Taylor ends up getting a pretty perfect pick, where the only person here that was going to use the veto on Pooch was Pooch. And along with that, Michael ends up being picked and does get his second veto win here. But this is where we do learn about his relationship with Taylor, to where he had already considered Taylor as part of his endgame plans with Brittany, though he doesn't use the veto here. But Pooch's fate was pretty much already sealed, and we do see Joseph trying to warn him of his fate. Pooch just passes it off as Joseph being clueless, but this does lead to what ends up being a Pooch blindside, despite the fact that it shouldn't have been a blindside, especially considering even he had started to pick up on the fact that he was going home the day before and did a lot of frantic scrambling that just really even further doomed him, but somehow he was able to convince himself that he was able to get the votes to stay. Though there was technically a push for him to stay from Monty, who actually pushes so much that ends up harming his position in the game. Though at the same time, this does show where he stands within the post-pack alliance, especially considering how blatantly Taylor was targeting Monty at this point in the game, which we even have Amira telling Monty about this, which really just shows you how messy of a player Amira is, considering she obviously wanted the opposite result, and this was completely counterproductive for her. But this is also where we get introduced to the Kyle-Alyssa showmance that start off really weird here, with Kyle trying to resist it, but this Alyssa relationship really ends up being an important one moving forward for the game, with Alyssa leaking information to him that he would later use to benefit his game, with her revealing to him about the girls alliance and that Taylor's being kept around to target the guys, which makes Kyle paranoid and makes him also want to keep Pooch around. Though they are able to get the numbers together, with Nicole and Amira being really adamant about taking Pooch out here, but this does end up completely fracturing the pose pack to the point where they seem poised to take shots at each other in the very next round, until a certain new twist messes that up, But again, Pooch is blindsided in a unanimous vote here, with Turner even voting against him after learning about the vote at the very last second. But with that, let's talk about Pooch, who I did see some upside from him coming into the season, but he really just ends up being a massive flop here. I mean, having this spectacular downfall, with him getting himself nominated in a position where most of the house already wanted him gone anyway. Again, a really terrible move there, and a lot of it seemed to stem from his overconfidence and his dislike of Taylor that again got icky at points. That really just made him a not likable figure outside of the humorous aspects of his eventual downfall here. But now for week 3, which ends up being an all-time great week of Big Brother, but it certainly didn't start that way. Starting off as the worst case scenario, where we start the week with the announcement of the Festy Bestie twist, which might be one of the worst twists in the history of Big Brother. A twist that you can tell production was proud of. And with the fact that the game was interesting moving forward, really despite the twist, I assure you that production got the wrong lesson from all this, thinking that this twist was a success, when in reality it was a twist that greatly benefits the majority. So much to the point where they can just dominate unfettered as long as they stick together, and also incentivizes them to stick together, as at that point, if they do, they are essentially guaranteed safety until the twist ends. And all that stems from the fact that this is a twist that makes it so that the players will be nominated in pairs, where the HOH will nominate one pair, meaning that you can only be on the block against whoever you're paired up with. And with the players getting to pick their own besties, it really just opens it up for the majority alliance. In this case, Pose Pack, to pick a partner not in their alliance, making it so that in every scenario, there will be a nominee not in the majority alliance, with the alliance now having the numbers to vote them out. Which in the scenario we see play out initially here, with the Pose Pack getting each into a separate pair, which the intentionality of it is questionable, though I do think figures like Michael and Nicole got the memo early on. But this is a twist so easily gamed, and I feel like most casts would game this instantly, and it really just makes the game boring. But even beyond that, another terrible aspect of this is the fact that the veto is also won as a pair, in a position if any of the figures within the Festy Bestie pairings wants to use the veto ends up being used, making it even easier for the majority alliance to get what they want. And while again the season thankfully doesn't play out in that worst case scenario, it does get very close to occurring here, and I do think does occur with most casts. And really this twist just feels like something production added to the game because they wanted to make their storytelling a lot easier, as when you have less options available, it does make it easier to tell that story. So this really just feels like a twist they liked because they were lazy. But we do see the besties getting selected through the Hoh Comp, where we do have this game of musical chairs with players picking their pairs as they're eliminated. And once again, Michael articulates the optimal strategy here and throws the HOH to be paired up with Brittany, which while it's a move that would have kept him safe, I did find it to be kind of a questionable move, as it does further lump him in with Brittany, but also means that he auto loses Brittany if they're on the block together, which is a very solid number for him. Though interestingly, considering how the house reconfigures after this round, this pairing ends up backfiring on him even more, but in a very different way, with him being one of the few pairs to have two people within the majority, making a lot of the game moving forward for the new majority to be based around the fact of keeping Brittany and Michael safe. But here we also see Nicole taking one for the team and pairing up with Taylor, which ironically ends up backfiring on her here as well. But here we do see Turner barely edging out Amira, in a position where Turner, unknowingly to him, was the target coming into this round by the majority of the house. So seeing this person blatantly on the bottom win HOH should have led to some intrigue here, but instead at the start we do see him decide to appease the house by planning on backdooring Taylor, which was really lame here and something that doesn't benefit his game at all at this position, just setting himself up to be the target for the very next round. Now I will say that technically his initial thought was to target the likes of Amira and Nicole, but he did back out of it, not thinking that he can get them out because of this twist, as it wouldn't allow him to put them up together, which again, another downside of the twist, along with the fact that initially Pose Pack ends up re-solidifying after being extremely fractured at the end of the last week because of this twist that initially to them automatically gained them safety moving forward. Now here we do also see Jasmine do effective work here for one of the few times in the season in convincing Turner that Taylor was the one to flip the votes against Pooch, which don't get how he believed that, but it does lead to him going through this Taylor backdoor plan by nominating Michael and Brittany initially here. Though again, it is funny how the show gives Amira credit for this, But pretty soon afterwards, this is where the entire game changes here, but not exactly in the way that the show portrays it, where here we have the events that lead up to the creation of the leftovers, but on the show it is shown that this was set in motion by Alyssa's previous leaking of the girls to Kyle, but in reality it was caused by a different leaking of information from Alyssa, where almost immediately after the formation of an alliance that did include her called the Old School Alliance, which included the likes of Amira and Nicole, she ends up telling Kyle about this, which leads to the likes of Kyle and Monty recognizing that they must be on the bottom of the Pose Pack Alliance, and this is where they talk to the remnants of the Oasis in Turner and Joseph about changing the plan to backdooring Amira, who they look at as the leader of the opposite side, though to be fair, Nicole probably would have been the target here instead had they had the numbers to get her out, though that would require Taylor to be on the block, losing them a number in the vote, so through that Amira becomes a better option. Either way, I mean, we do see them talk about bringing in the likes of Brittany and Michael, and later also Taylor, to create this new majority alliance, which we would later know as the Leftovers. This alliance that just runs the middle portion of the game, and the remnants of the Oasis here ends up being the core of this group named the Pound. And with that, I do feel like there are some misconceptions over the creation of this alliance. Or again, a lot of the talk about the formation of this alliance happened before the veto was even played. Which now you get a lot of talk about how the Leftovers was made to counter the bad treatment of Taylor, when in reality, it was made because it was good for the games of the people in the Pound, and really the bad treatment of Taylor was something they weaponized in the game here, as it allowed them to pick up Taylor as a number, and also allowed them to guise their game moves moving forward as moves that were made due to the way that she was treated, and it allowed for the show to obviously make this seem like it was the reason, when in reality the reason was more so game-based over it being a moral issue. And also I find it weird how the show portrays Turner in this as this like very willing participant in this plan, and that how he's excited to flip up the game, when in reality he had to be constantly convinced to go through with this plan, as really despite Turner ending up being the one to make one of the biggest moves of the season here, he in actuality is a very passive player, and one that is very scared to make these big moves, but is also one that is easily manipulated into doing whatever his alliance wants him to do. But this again leads up to the Veto Comp, where Nicole and Taylor end up being picked to play, and here we do get this massive dilemma for Nicole, with her now having to throw the competition, which bizarrely ends up being part of the impetus of the later blow up on Taylor, where the entire house notices that Nicole has gotten emotional after leaving the DR, and Daniel goes to console her, and the show makes this out to be that this is because she now knows that she has to throw the comp, though I believe she also got emotional from getting a sense in the DR that her anti-Taylor behavior wasn't being received well. So obviously the way they react to that is to hate Taylor even more, and we do see that literally at the same time that Daniel and Nicole are bad-mouthing Taylor and talking about getting rid of her, we cut to Taylor leading a prayer for her, thinking that she must have heard some bad news about her mother who had cancer, and we see Taylor getting really emotional in the DR for her, only for Nicole to take this as an insult when Taylor tells her that she should do what's best. It takes it as if Taylor's trying to get her to quit the game, which pisses off Daniel, leading to this big confrontation between Daniel, Nicole, and Taylor that I do think finally gave the audience an example of how poorly Taylor was treated across the season here, but also just shows Daniel and Nicole in the very villainous light here that led to these glorious downfalls for them moving forward. But in this confrontation, which does start off with some humor as Taylor thought he was joking around to begin with, and does lead to some genuine confusion over what Daniel's talking about here, but then Daniel takes it way too far, again blaming her for the Paloma quit, and then we see Nicole telling her to learn how to speak to people and calls her passive aggressive and rude, which ironically is how I would describe Nicole. And again, to follow this up with Taylor crying in a DR, talking about hurting the people that she tries to get close to, was genuinely heartbreaking there. And again, this is what the producers try to say is what got the Leftovers to come together, where by this point the plan had already been made to pull Taylor in, but they were just waiting for the veto results to actually put their plan into action. And we do get to the Veto Comp, where it is a paired one that essentially gets handed to Michael and Brittany here, with Nicole already throwing the competition, but also Turner and Jasmine having to sit out due to Jasmine fainting from her fear of heights. But this ends up being the perfect result for the Pounds here, who now put their plan into action, where we do see Joseph having just turned 25, which was a funny meme that he became a better player after his birthday, but ends up pulling Michael and Brittany into the alliance. And we also see this great conversation between Monty and Taylor, with her being able to talk about the issues that she's dealt with due to her skin color, and we do see Monty being the one to inform Taylor that she's going to be safe, leading to her joining the HOH room, where we do see the formal formation of the leftovers, with this being the cliffhanger for the Wednesday night episode, a fantastic moment in what is really a mediocre season up to this point, and something we rarely see in modern Big Brother, to see the players that feel like they're on the outs of the core power structure coming together to flip the game on its head. It's a moment that felt very reminiscent to that of the formation of the Sovereign Six back in BB6, especially with the leftovers now containing the only semblance of what were somewhat likable people on this very unlikable cast. So we now see the leftovers becoming the majority alliance, being the ones to use the festy bestie twist to their advantage, which again made the twist more tolerable, that it was this more likable group of players that were able to steamroll because of it, but that doesn't change the fact that the twist is just inherently terrible. Well, so here we do see the leftovers play really secretively, keeping their alliance covert moving forward, and it was great to see them formulate plans and how to keep themselves a secret, all leading up to the veto ceremony, where we do see Turner blindside Amira and Terrence, along with half the house, and in turn makes a speech calling everyone out for their treatment of Taylor. A nice moment for Taylor, but also one that they use as a smokescreen to explain Turner's move here to the rest of the house, making the other leftovers not look involved in this plan. And I will say that the feeds immediately after the veto ceremony here are some of the best feeds I've ever seen in my entire life, to where I was just glued to the feeds for the next few hours, seeing the former old school alliance running with their heads cut loose and spending a lot of time blaming each other and just buying into all the lying from the leftovers, with them spiraling in this very Falte-esque way, where we see the likes of Amira and Nicole blame all this on a comment Indy made to Taylor, not recognizing their own terrible treatment of her. Finally get something that didn't make the show, but there was this drama between Nicole and Alyssa, with Nicole being upset that Alyssa accidentally leaked some minor information in front of Indy, which is really humorous considering all this happened due to Alyssa leaking some major information that she didn't even know about at this point. But this finally leads to Daniel being upset at Nicole because she ignored him during this situation, which leads to this ridiculous reconciliation between the two, with them both coming off as children during that conversation with how petty they seem to be there. But the leftovers really run circles around the others across this week, with the house still thinking that Amira is safe, with Terrence even lying down his game for her. And we do get another ridiculous Nicole scene of her revealing to Terrence that he's going home, and along with the fact that she was a former cop, which no one cares about. But we do get this glorious eviction here, one of the most satisfying moments in modern Big Brother, to see the leftovers successfully pull off this blindside on Amira, with Amira even thinking that Nicole and Daniel were the ones behind it. And we do see them create this massive plot to rationalize their votes in saying that Taylor overheard a conversation about post-pack and switched the votes the last second, which seemed really improbable, but it does stick for some reason here. And we do end this round with the reveal that the surviving member of the block gets to pick a pair to join, which here we do see the leftovers successfully game this mechanic, with Joseph doing some good work here and getting Terrence to pick him and Monty, essentially now saving them from being evicted moving forward, with Terrence being the easy boot if they were on the block, leaving Michael and Brittany as the only pair fully comprising of leftover members, where with mixing that in with the veto rules of a bestie pair holding the veto, it essentially means that the only way for a leftover to go home in the following weeks is that if Michael and Brittany are backdoored, as literally every other possibility would lead to the veto being used on them, which left the leftovers near impenetrable for the next few rounds. But moving forward, let's talk about the boot in Amira, who for boot this early did play a solid game here, and I do think moving forward will be looked at as one of these what could have been sort of players, and one that will be brought up for potential second chance casts. But I do think as a whole Amira was a bit overrated, where I do think while her exit was very abnormal here, and there's an element of her being minorly twist screwed, she was also a very messy player, and one that was too blatant of a threat to a lot of the house, to where even before the formation of the leftovers, she already had people wanting to target her, and was also pretty aloof to the fact that people were planning on voting her out as well. So again, I do think she's a player with potential, but based on what we've actually seen, she does have a number of massive faults that did eventually lead to her being the big target on the board to begin with. But now for week 4, which with the leftovers now in full control, this should have been a very straightforward week, but we do still get some pretty interesting gameplay and a fascinating downfall for Nicole along the way. Now, it does really start off with a dumb HOH competition where we again waste time with a qualifying round that was literally just a luck-based competition of finding an envelope with a red invitation in it. And this ends up leading to a bad draw for leftovers, with most of those being eliminated in this first round being leftover members. With this being another of Michael's genuine competition losses, though again it was a complete crapshoot. But despite the odds, Monty ends up winning HOH, but again it really didn't matter, as due to the Festy Bestie twist, making it near impossible for a leftover member to go home anyway. But it also again at least let the likable people here hold control, which made it so it wasn't completely insufferable. But initially Nicole is the target for this round, but Taylor ends up being against this plan, as that would mean she would have to go on the block again, which did feel like a misstep from my point of view, as it did feel like Taylor should have just ripped off the band-aid at this point, just get it done as quickly as possible, especially with the leftovers being as solidified as they were at this point, with it being immediately after their initial formation, where she should have been pretty locked safe on the block. And it felt like by her prolonging this, it really just opened up the opportunities for things to go wrong down the road. But her hesitance here does lead to the leftovers agreeing to not put her up on the block again, and instead put up Alyssa and Indy as the only pair not including any leftover members. And this is where we do see more of the Alyssa Kyle showmance, including some weird content on the show of her revealing that she has someone back at home, which felt like it was added in here because Kyle was willing to let her go at this point, and the show wanted to justify that. But even beyond just letting her go home, for some reason Kyle actively campaigns against her, which really makes no sense from a game standpoint here, where I get that he wanted her out as she was a distraction for him, but she was still a completely loyal number for him, loyal to a fault, where she ruins her own game through how loyal she has been to him at this point. So for him to actively want her out in this position, hyping her up as this massive social threat, was really misguided here, especially as moving forward, we do see the leftovers using these arguments against him in their own campaigns to get Alyssa out. And this to me was the first glimpse into the messiness of Kyle's game, where up to this point, he was playing really well. I mean, he was the person who got the info that allowed them to form the leftovers to begin with, and was a central figure within the strategy of that group, while also being the best positioned in that group, having the pound while also having deals with Michael and Brittany. At this point, he had Monty thinking Kyle was his closest ally, and he also ends up forming a final two with Turner across this week as well, and with him also having that Alyssa connection as well. Kyle was in the best position by a mile, but it really ends up being his own messy gameplay and paranoia that gets him out of that position moving forward. But with this, it is also the point where Kyle and Alyssa start to formally become a showmance, and through that starts to change his tune about Alyssa. But again, it was a bit too late for him, where he was already the one that started the train to begin with. And this gets even more complicated with Kyle and Daniel winning the veto here, which was a bizarre veto involving these weird like psych trip cartoons that really made me question why I even watch this show. But this puts Kyle in a very precarious spot, with the Alliance now wanting him to not use the veto and send Alyssa out, which would have been bad for his game here in letting her go, but also would be a bad look for him to have finally hooked up with her just to vote her out immediately afterward. But he did seem willing to go along with this plan at this point, even though he really didn't want to. But here we do see a lot of impressive work from Michael, where this is where he forms his final three with Brittany and Taylor, though technically they do form a final two behind his back, making Brittany actually one of the best positioned players in the game at this point, despite not having much win equity. Here we do see Michael plotting ahead, thinking about when is the right time to flip against the leftovers and setting himself up for that scenario. But also here we do see him take advantage of this target on Alyssa's back by recognizing that if Alyssa goes home, Indy will have to pick a pair to join and will more than likely pick him and Brittany, which in turn would keep him safe, as there's now a non-leftover member in that pairing, but is able to use this to campaign to the remaining leftovers, as by doing this ends up protecting all of them, as if this did end up occurring, there would literally be no scenario where leftover goes home until the Festy Bestie twist ends up ending, which is good for the Alliance as a whole, and Michael does really effective work in getting the entire Alliance to see it this way, as well as furthering the pressure on Kyle to go through this plan, though I will say that at the moment that Kyle pushes back on this plan, I don't get why the leftovers were so resolute in needing this to happen, considering the Fessy Bessie twist was clearly nearing its end anyway, so this doesn't really even gain them that much, considering that scenario where one of them goes home is an extremely niche one anyway, where the only chance of one of them going home is by Brittany and Michael being backdoored, which is an extremely unlikely scenario. But all this, again, doesn't matter anyway because of the Daniel side of things, which is just such a funny aspect of this round, where Daniel starts off this week knowing that him and Nicole were the targets for this round, and when talking to Monty, he initially realizes that they are planning on backdooring Nicole, and talks about not using the veto, and even calls out the others for working together, like correctly calling out the leftover alliance outside of a very important member in Kyle, which ends up being a massive blind spot for him moving forward. But despite the terrible move that he proceeds to make, it is the fact that him and Nicole are the only ones at this point that have any recognition that there is a majority group working against them, unlike the likes of Indy, Jasmine, and Alyssa at this point. That does make them not the worst players in the world to me, but again, we do follow this up with this really dumb move from Daniel, where we do see Monty genuinely approaching Daniel and Nicole and truthfully telling them to not use the veto, in that if Daniel does, Nicole will go home. And humorously, this ends up actually convincing Daniel and Nicole of the opposite, thinking that Monty has now realized that he doesn't have the votes to get rid of Nicole, when no, he's legitimately warning them here. But they are now convinced that they have Kyle on their side and will have the numbers to take out Taylor and be able to save their other alliance members in Alyssa and Indy in the process. But instead, by using the veto here, he ends up dooming his closest ally in Nicole and makes him the number one target for the following round, and also ends up undoing a lot of the good work that Michael had just put in, causing his plan to completely crumble there. Though interestingly, this all happens at the very last second, with most of the leftovers actually being blindsided when the veto does get used, as there wasn't enough time to spread the word to everybody, and we do see Taylor being really upset over this, despite again, it was probably for the better for her game here, keeping her pretty safe moving forward, but it ends up working out perfectly here for Kyle, with his game position staying intact, with him now being able to blame Daniel for pretty much everything here. But again, from Daniel's point of view, this round ends up being a really funny one, where to him, he is thinking that he is doing essentially what the leftovers did the previous round and gathering all the outsiders. The only thing is that he didn't realize that they had already done that the previous week, and that they had the numbers by this point. But we do get some great moments on the way out for Nicole, with her and Daniel continuing to look delusional and them calling everyone else clowns when they're the clowns in this situation. We have them having a long pouting session when learning that Nicole is going home, and that was pretty fun. We have more self-importance from Nicole, of her revealing to everyone that she's a former cop, which again, who cares, but Nicole does go home in a 9-1 vote. And we do see Taylor joining Alyssa and Indy to further secure herself. And we finally end the Thursday night episode with Daniel going off on a spiel about how Monty and Michael have already won the game, which puts a bigger bullseye on his back, but also he just says end the season already right before the episode cuts off. Before moving on, let's talk about Nicole, who again had a spectacular downfall in the last 2 weeks, being the best position coming out of week 2, only for her entire game to crumble around her throughout week 3, and still not recognizing how bad of a position she was in by the time of week 4, to where she is so confident she's going to stay over Taylor, and really just looks like an idiot on her way out here. Really just a fun downfall to see after how terribly she had treated Taylor in the previous weeks, and also how cocky she was in the game, so we're seeing her boot here continued what was a glorious boot order for the pre-jury phase of the game here. But now for week 5, which does end up being a slower week, but still a week not void of things to talk about. Now most of the week does revolve around the downfall of Daniel, being another satisfying boot for the pre-jury phase. But this week does start with Daniel still going on about how no one is playing the game, and again pissing off Monty and Michael along the way with his constant talk about how they're going to win the game, leading to a fight between him and Monty, and also Michael vocalizing how annoyed he is that his game is being put out there, which ends up being pretty bad for Daniel, considering Michael ends up winning the next Hoh Comp. And right away the plan becomes to backdoor Daniel, hooding up Monty, Joseph, and Terrence with the fake plan to the non-leftovers, being that Monty is the target if the noms stay the same, when really Terrence will end up going home in that spot. Though this week does contain a lot of talk about the possibility of actually targeting Monty, and a lot of this stems from missteps that Monty and Joseph were making in the previous week, where they end up really talking up how good of relationships they have with the other side to the leftovers, which makes the likes of Michael and Kyle skeptical of them and talk about the possibility of keeping Daniel in the game to go after Monty. But ironically, it ends up being how wrong Monty is there, in that the other side decides to target Monty in this position, despite Monty thinking that he has a good relationships with the likes of Indy and Jasmine. That actually leads to Michael not going through this plan, as at that point Monty is just outright a shield for him. But I should also mention that this is the week where Kyle starts to have suspicions about a potential Cookout 2.0, which these suspicions later blow up his game during his eventual boot round. But obviously, all of this is a very controversial situation, where my opinion on it is that I do think him having the thought of the possibility of a Cookout 2.0, a style of alliance we had just seen dominate the season right beforehand, is not an inherent bad thought to consider. On paper, it is not any different than looking out for like a bomb squad or a brigade, though obviously the aspects of race being incorporated into it does make it a bit more of a tricky subject. But again, the initial thought is not something I would consider bad within the context of this literally happening last season. What is bad to me is the fact that Kyle allows this paranoia over this presumed alliance that isn't real to dictate his entire game, where because of this notion he ends up dropping his relationship with Monty, who had fully trusted Kyle up until this point. The group of players that he considers his closest allies are the players that just so happen to be white. Now, I will say that if he didn't mention race within any of these conversations and just propose this new alliance that he does propose in this week, that ends up essentially being an all-white alliance, I don't think it would have been as controversial to me, as it actually does make sense to people that are in this alliance. Where from Kyle's point of view, he obviously has his showmance with Alyssa, he has a final 2 with Turner, and then he does have a final 3 that he formed really early on in the game with Michael and Brittany. So to have these 5 people come together is actually pretty optimal for Kyle from a game position. It is by his mentioning of this being a counter to a Cookout 2.0 that really makes this icky. Again, for me, Kyle's actions surrounding the concept of the unfounded alliance here are the bad part to me over just the initial thought of that. But beyond this, we do end up seeing Daniel and Kyle not getting picked for the vetoes, seemingly sealing Daniel's fate, though we do get some intrigue with Daniel re-solidifying his relationship with Terrence, which comprises of them just moping around for most of the week, bad talking the rest of the cast. But this does lead to Terrence wanting to throw the Veto Comp to save Daniel, not realizing that if he stays on the block, he is going home, which ends up being a humorous series of events here, where the veto does end up being Otev, and it comes down to Terrence and Michael, and Terrence really blatantly throws the comp here, which again could have humorously sent him home because of that. Though Michael again does still decide to go through the Daniel back door, which seals his fate when on the block against Kyle, who is really just never going home in this situation, with him having the leftovers and Alyssa at minimum, though we do see the likes of Terrence and Jasmine really campaigning for Daniel to stay here and wanting Monty out, which really actually just further re-solidifies the leftovers in the process, with them now not having many doubts about Monty. Also, we do get a fun speech from Michael when he puts Daniel on the block, mirroring back to Daniel's speech when he put Taylor on the block, which was a fun way to blindside him here, though also through this week we do end up seeing more doubt being put onto Joseph, who really just decides to play the other side in making an alliance called the Five Swatters with them and ratting out that alliance to the leftovers, only for the leftovers to be upset that he is double dealing and wants to throw comps to keep up appearances. And it's like, why is he saying this? Again, like, just very questionable decision making here from Joseph. And again, like, straight up the answer is that because he is a messy player and he is still a blindly loyal guy to boot, which does make him a really likable presence here, but one that made some, again, very irrational game decisions along the way, and this one does make him poised to be the first out with the leftovers at this point in the game. But also across this week we do get some humorous content as well, from this being the week where the Turner-Jasmine rivalry finally gets focused on the show, where you get shown Muffin Gate, which was a fun series of events. I do love the editing of how they revealed that Turner was the one to steal the muffin. We also see Turner call her out for faking her injury and also mocking her accent and sayings in the DR, and this was all just pretty fun content. But the vote ends up being pretty mundane, though they do try to act like there's still a chance that Kyle might go home through Joseph maybe switching his vote to keep up appearances with the other side, and also Daniel telling Alyssa that Kyle considered not saving her the previous round. And again, none of this actually ends up going through, though I do find it funny how constant the talk is here about how showmances don't make it far and are bad for your game, which is just factually untrue. But for some reason, the stigma is still talked about on the show here, but we do end the week with a pretty fun eviction for Daniel, who clearly knows he's going home and gives this really funny speech to me about how he hopes that everyone votes to evict him. He calls them bozos and clowns. He again calls out Michael and Monty once again and says after he leaves, the season will be boring. And again, all this delusional talk from Daniel here was so funny to me. And we get a great interview of Julie as well, where you see his face crack when she mentions the poor treatment of Taylor, and we have the players being pretty ruthless to him in the goodbye messages. Again, all just a really fun way to see Daniel's run end here, feeling like a nice comeuppance for him. So again, Daniel is a figure here that did come off as mostly unlikable with his poor treatment of Taylor and his really cocky attitude, but the fact that he was so cocky in the game, and unwarrantedly so, makes him a really funny character to me, especially in his last couple weeks here, where he still proceeds to act as if he's the best player in the house, despite everything going wrong around him. I mean, again, he has this blatant blunder of him using the veto, which takes out his closest ally, yet he is still so cocky afterwards. Now, that being said, I don't actually think he's as bad of a player as some people say. I remember some people claiming that he's a bottom 10 player of all time, and to be honest, I don't even think he's even close. I mean, he's the only person in the minority here that ended up realizing that there was even an other side to combat against. He also plays his final round here actually decently well, considering the position he was already in coming into the round. Now again, his cockiness and his emotional nature are major flaws of his game, but to me he is in conversation for the worst player of all time. But now for week 6, the start of the jury phase, and this ends up being another week that could have been really boring considering the fact that the leftovers still had full control, but for some reason they really had to overcomplicate it here to the point where we end this week with the leftovers completely fractured for seemingly no reason. And really just almost everyone plays this round pretty suboptimally here, but the week does start with the end of the Festy Bestie twists, which thank God. But also we get the wall HOH comp, which we do end up seeing Taylor win, keeping the leftovers in power, and seeing Taylor in power for the first time in the game. And it is here where we realize she doesn't know what to do when she's in power, where right away, instead of consulting her own alliance members on what to do, she ends up talking to everyone outside of the leftovers, while the remaining leftovers gather together to create the plan for the week, though at the same time, Taylor is in the HOH promising almost everyone's safety, with her planning to nominate her own alliance members as pawns to keep up appearances here, which was just really dumb. And really just in general, I will say that is something that in general annoyed me about the leftovers by this point in the game, is how secretive they were still trying to be, and how far out of the way they were going to remain a secret when none of it really mattered. Again, they already had a massive numbers advantage at this point, and it felt like the micromanaging of their alliance's notoriety was something that was just extremely damaging to the stability of the alliance at this point, and also just damaging to their jury management as well, where they really just go out of their way here to tell so many unnecessary lies that just weren't really worth doing. But Taylor still pretends to be targeting Monty here, and also talked about using Turner as a pawn. That just, again, all felt unnecessary and putting your own allies in danger. But also we do have Taylor wanting to target Terrence in this position, while the remaining leftovers already agreed to target Indy, considering the fact that she did the best in the wall comp, though really none of this even really matters either, as again, there are pros and cons for keeping either, and really it's interchangeable here. But we do end up seeing Jasmine being talked about as a target as well, but Taylor instantly turns that down, being unwilling to put her up, which I 100% get from a moral standpoint of her not wanting to nominate another black woman, though it does seem kind of ironic considering Jasmine for sure does not have that same courtesy, and through there also being other options in Terrence and Indy, who, if they were to win down the road, it does end up being a pretty understandable decision for her to make here as well, though it is funny to see Jasmine getting saved here due to something completely out of her own control. But again, Taylor's initial nom plans here did come off as extremely short-sighted and seemingly accidentally, as I do feel like she was truly loyal to the leftovers, but just didn't think it all the way through, and through just one conversation with Turner and Monty, they're able to poke holes in her plan to where the nominees do end up being Terrence and Indy instead. But this is where we do see the Taylor-Joseph relationship really blossom, where we do see the two pretend to be in a showmance to the rest of the house to again explain why they're close, which just felt unnecessary. But with that, Joseph ends up actually gaining a bit of power over the course of this week, having a major influence over Taylor's HOH, with her really just going along with all the plans he would bring up, no matter how ridiculous they end up being, which is where we get to the most ridiculous of these plans, where Joseph comes up with a plan to keep up appearances once again with the other side, while also allowing them to keep Monty safe, while also giving Taylor a move for her resume in backdooring him, which obviously doesn't go through, but also just doesn't make sense. It's all so dumb for Joseph to volunteer to have people put him up in a position where he could have gone home. But again, this is a plan that doesn't go through, not because they realize how dumb of an idea this is, but because Joseph and Taylor end up being tied to each other after the Veto Comp, with them not being able to really have many game conversations with many other people, which made the entire ploy improbable. But again, I don't get how they genuinely thought this was a good idea to begin with, especially considering, again, there were genuine talks about taking out Joseph at this point, if this did happen, which obviously would be bad for Joseph's game, but would also have Taylor losing an extremely close ally during her own HOH, and all for the name of hiding the leftovers for some reason. I mean, this really would have been humorous to see actually go through, especially if Joseph did go home in this spot, where again, the likes of Kyle, Michael, and Brittany were already having these conversations. And I do think the show didn't properly demonstrate how willing Kyle was to flip against the leftovers even at this point, even before the veto, where he really wanted Joseph out from the offset, and we later see him revealing the pound to Michael and Brittany in an attempt to flip them over. But this obviously gets really expedited after the veto, where coming into it, the plan was for everyone to use the veto, as it was supposed to be an easy indie boot here, but to use the veto as a smokescreen to pretend like the target was still on Monty or Joseph in this position now. So that is why we do see Kyle decide to win the veto under that context, where this would give them an excuse to use the veto on Alyssa, which works out perfectly for Kyle. But during the veto competition, we do see Alyssa make a really terrible move here in taking the London trip from Taylor, the HOH, in a position where she threatens Alyssa with saying that if you do this, I still have a replacement nom. And while I do think it is pretty petty from Taylor's end to now target Alyssa after this is still terrible from Alyssa's end as well. But again, considering Taylor's obsession with needing to have a reason to allow her to mask the leftovers, this really made Taylor tunnel visioned on getting Alyssa out at this point, despite the fact that it makes no sense for Kyle to be using the veto in a position where it will take Alyssa out of the game. And obviously Joseph was in her ear stoking this thought as well, which for Joseph is 100% the correct move for him to make here, weakening Kyle in the game and taking out someone that he has no real connection to. But this is something he should have been pushing from the very beginning instead of plotting for his own back door. And through him waiting so long to campaign against Alyssa here, it makes it so that Kyle was okay with winning the veto, to where he otherwise would have probably thrown it and just let Alyssa go. And with the fact that Kyle and Alyssa got a bit closer this week, it does lead to this even bigger dilemma for Kyle, more so than what happened a couple rounds ago. But again, from my point of view, I do feel like it's ridiculous that the leftovers even thought that Kyle would be okay, with him being the reason that Alyssa goes home here. I mean, I feel like with most alliances, they would be understanding in this situation, but for some reason, the likes of Taylor, Monty, and Joseph were so resolute in getting Alyssa out here, and I feel like this is a situation where the cookout probably played a factor into how these players were looking at the leftover alliance here, where again, they just came from watching the cookout. Really the only large alliance in the history of Big Brother to fully hold true to the very end, and having to make sacrifices in order to get themselves to the end. But again, for the cookout, that was obviously because they had a greater reason for doing so, which again, most alliances do not. There is a reason why that had not happened until the cookout, as making the move that's better for the alliance as a whole is very rarely better for every member within it. And for Kyle in this position, getting rid of Alyssa surely wasn't in his best interest. And it really feels like some of the players in this season came out of watching last season and expected the loyalty that the cookout displayed to just be the norm, when again, it was anything but. But again, this ends up completely fracturing the leftovers here, where they would have been more prone to targeting each other moving forward, with Kyle already being fully ready to make the first strike. And again, this should have just been an easy week, where who cares who goes home out of the non-leftovers here? It really is such a minute difference for most of the players involved, but through Kyle going against what the leftovers wanted here, he ends up being pushed to the bottom of the alliance, with the likes of Taylor and Monty and Joseph talking about how he needs to be the first to go from the group now, taking Kyle out of this perfect position he was in coming into the round. But even beyond that, Michael and Brittany are able to take advantage of this situation, where they're essentially taking Kyle's spot in the alliance of being the one that's playing both sides, stoking this impending war between Kyle and the likes of Monty and Joseph, which is the perfect position for them to be in, though with that does come some ickiness, with them essentially weaponizing Kyle's Cookout 2.0 sentiment to position themselves better in the game, where while they do make it clear to him that they are never going to play the game based off of race, they do still enable Kyle to play that way and technically want him to play that way, as it betters their games here. Though strangely, the Wednesday night episode does end on the cliffhanger of the leftovers forming these plans without Kyle, and this leads to a 2-hour Thursday night episode that largely just came off as filler, with them spending so much time on punishments from the Veto Comp, and we see this arguing between Kyle and Alyssa over his hot and cold nature with her. But it is in this episode that we do see the leftovers meeting over this topic, where they really just end up circling around the same points over and over again, with neither side really listening to the other. And really, there was no way Kyle was ever going to use the veto here, which does come off as a blindside to the other side of the house that was expecting Monty to be backdoored, and also ends up making Kyle look like the bad guy here to Indy in particular, who thought they were in this 5 swatters together. And we do also get this ridiculous moment of Taylor pretending to yell at Kyle after the ceremony that again just felt unnecessary. This is also where the show finally shows a bit of Kyle's Cookout 2.0 comments, which really didn't go as in depth as I feel like they should have here. And I know a lot of people claim that Big Brother was protecting Kyle in this situation, but in reality, I really don't think that's the case. I don't think production cares about Kyle at all. They are clearly just protecting themselves. I think they care about their image and not wanting to have any negative publicity for the show, and through minimalizing this storyline on the show, I think to them it was their way of handling their perception, though I do think it was extremely misguided and obviously just ends up leading to a disappointing portrayal of these events on the show, while also making it look like they're trying to hide things for the sake of Kyle, which is just not a good look either. But eventually we do finally get to the eviction, where Indy is finally taken out, and let's talk about Indy, who was there. I think Indy's probably one of the worst casting choices in recent years, but they're really bringing nothing to the show and nothing to the game either. I mean, she was a player that knew nothing about the game coming into it and really didn't seem to want to play the game either. Again, she was a fan of Big Brother Brazil and wanted that type of experience when they are just two very drastically different games. And Indy really just didn't do much for me on this season, and really for me, she's just a massive dud here. But with that, let's jump into week 7, a very unique week that is entirely comprised of a new twist, the split house twist. One similar to what we've seen in recent Survivor seasons of it essentially being a tribe swap post-merge, and that is what we get here. The final 10 ends up being broken up into 2 groups of 5, with the 2 rounds of the game happening simultaneously, with no communication between the 2 sides, and through this week we end up evicting 1 player from each side, essentially taking the spot of a double eviction. And I do think conceptually this twist is actually a really interesting shakeup to the modern landscape of Big Brother, one that by this point in the game we are typically waiting for the majority alliance to crumble. But this twist allows for more room to allow those alliances to shift and recreate new dynamics by having these groups separated for a week, opening up the game for the following week. So I do like aspects of this twist, though I don't think it was executed well on this season. Now, the HOH ends up being the knockout comp, where Terrence surprisingly performs well here, coming in second, with it being a position where the top 2 in this competition become the 2 HOHs, where Terrence becomes an HOH along with Michael, which the mechanics of determining the HOHs here is fine to me, but I don't love how they determine the groups, where they do end up having a schoolyard pick here, which to be fair works out in their favor, largely because the leftovers were already fractured, and Terrence was someone not in that majority alliance, being one of the HOHs, and also we had Michael not picking Kyle. That does cause a crack in their relationship moving forward, but normally I feel like this would just lead to the majority getting even more power, as even in this position, we do see Michael really gaming this system to getting the perfect pick for him, with him getting his two closest allies in Brittany and Taylor as a way to protect them, while also getting Jasmine as his primary target and Monty as a clear backup. While Kyle and Alyssa are on the other side with Joseph, who is both Terrence and Kyle's primary targets coming into this round. So the split does play out in an interesting way here for one side of the house, but still in a way that could be easily gamed if they were to do this twist the exact same way again. But another aspect of this twist I didn't like was how half the house had to live inside while the other half lived outside. And for the players on the outside, it really just felt like they were miserable the entire time. But even beyond that, it's them being confined in this very small area that makes it tough to strategize with it being out in the open. And through that, you can see what the other players are doing. It leads to a lot of whispering and an area that doesn't have a good enough audio setup outside to properly capture what's going on, and also opens up the possibility of wall yellers, which may or may not have played a factor in this round that ended up turning down the feeds for the outsiders for quite a while. And through that, there's a lot of unknowns on what exactly happened with the outsiders throughout this week. So again, those are all terrible aspects of this twist, but again, I do think it's a twist that could be interesting on a return if they do workshop it a bit. But with that, let's start talking about the events of the week, starting with Big Brochella, the Insiders, which was definitely a lot more tame than the other side, where again, Michael had a clear target here in Jasmine and Monty as the backup, and again, there wasn't that much interesting happening on this side. We do get some humor from Jasmine continuing to use her birthday as a reason to not put her up, but she does get nominated alongside Monty anyway, with her thinking that Monty is the target. But through Brittany winning the stay or fold veto, which was one that Michael could have easily won had he not consistently folded, it does lead to Nom staying the same, though we do get a little bit of intrigue through Monty becoming more scared of Michael's comp ability through that competition, to where he starts campaigning to Taylor about taking Michael out, which again is happening during Michael's HOH, which was just ridiculous and could have easily backfired on him, with really through the votes of just Brittany and Michael he would have gone home. Especially as we do see Taylor eventually tell Brittany about this information, though again it all leads up to nothing, and Jasmine goes out pretty unceremoniously here, to where really a lot of the focus from the players on the inside was more so based around speculating on what's happening with the outside, with worry that Kyle would flip on the leftovers, and Brittany and Michael continuing to stoke the flames here, and talking about how Kyle should be the next target, and we get a lot of talk from Taylor about being worried about Joseph. And with that, let's start talking about Dire Fest, the outsider group, which felt like a direct contrast to the stagnation of the Insiders, with Terrence in power here, being the first time the Leftover Alliance had to face any adversity, with Joseph being Terrence's target, and the only non-leftover here was Alyssa, the person that Terrence seemed the most resolute in keeping safe, though we do still see Joseph and Turner remaining loyal to the Leftovers here, with the intention of using the veto in a way to force Alyssa on the block, being able to take her out there, though that obviously doesn't benefit Kyle. And this is where we do see Kyle make his big move here, where he decides to blow up the Leftovers. And I will say, there are obviously things to criticize Kyle for, including his gameplay coming into this round, where he took himself out of this very prime position to just skate through the game, but the way he does play this round here is actually insanely impressive. Being the first to rat out the Leftovers to Alyssa and Terrence, revealing pretty much everything about the inner workings of the Alliance while also exaggerating aspects of it, particularly the amount of control that Joseph and Monty had, while also pretending that Joseph created the Alliance when in reality it was him. But this ends up being really impressive work in keeping Kyle off the block initially, making it near impossible for a Leftover to not leave this week, with Joseph being the clear target unless he wins the veto, getting Terrence to blindside Turner, who he had previously promised safety to, and locking in the target on Joseph, who despite his later attempts to spill information of his own that counters Kyle's, Terrence does end up believing it over what Kyle had already told him, as Kyle got to him first. So again, this was all really impressive work from Kyle there, but also really impressive work in how he solidifies the Dire Fest members moving forward, giving him half the remaining players left on his side to face off against the other side, in turn getting Turner to eventually turn on Joseph as well, and putting Kyle in a much better position now than what he was coming into the week. Though we do have some complications along the way, namely in the wall yellers that seem to play a factor in the renom, where we do see Terrence winning the veto, and what seemed to be a pretty unfair veto competition where the win played a major factor there, and just in general it was a pretty lame competition of stacking to-go boxes, which felt like something you would see from Big Brother 2, but out of nowhere, Terrence ends up deciding to take Turner down and puts up Kyle, which again, we don't see why this happened, and with the appearance of wall yellers and the fact that the feeds were down for days, it does feel like that played a factor in Terrence not putting all of his trust into Kyle and putting him up to seemingly test him, which just felt weird, especially because he didn't seem to have given anyone the heads up that this was happening. But really, Joseph remains a target despite this. And I will say that it is sad to see Joseph being so disheveled throughout a lot of this week, with his DRs looking like he's had all of his energy sapped from him. Though through a lot of this, Joseph is still seemingly thinking that Kyle is still on his side. And I really don't get how him and Turner didn't figure out sooner that Kyle had ratted them out, especially with Terrence's explanation to Turner about why he was nominated really making no sense. But I know people were frustrated with Turner for siding with Kyle over Joseph here, but really, what were you expecting? It's pretty obvious that this is the move to make for Turner, with him having a final two with Turner at this point, while Joseph has so many other options on the other side. Again, it's not a surprise to me that he ends up sticking by Kyle in this situation, but we do end up seeing Terrence leak to Joseph here that Kyle is coming for him, again, seemingly a move influenced by the wall yellers, but this does make Joseph go all out on his way out and just dumping information in the hopes that something sticks, but it never does. Despite him revealing true information about Kyle, with him saying that Kyle was the one to form the leftovers and Kyle had been campaigning against Alyssa. But all this leads up to the entire group essentially just ganging up on him instead, where you see Alyssa in particular get upset at Joseph instead of Kyle, which all this did makes Joseph come off as a much more sympathetic figure on his way out here. But again, he makes a very questionable choice, where he does also decide to essentially throw Michael, Brittany, and Taylor under the bus on his way out here as well, which did feel like a final act of desperation that ends up not working. But he does reveal the information that Taylor had given him about Taylor, Michael, and Brittany working together, and that they want to pull him in, which does end up putting a bigger target on their backs in the following week, with Kyle now distrusting Michael and Brittany, making Michael a clear target for the next round. But again, despite all this, Joseph still couldn't save himself here. But with that, let's talk about the two boots of this round, starting off with Jasmine, who was a largely unlikable figure throughout a lot of the season, with her irrational hatred for Taylor being the biggest anti-Taylor figure, though a lot of that was behind her back, and she was also a seemingly mediocre player to boot, with her not having much respect while out there. But I will say that I did end up finding her a bit of a humorous figure by the end of her run here, through instances like Muffingate and her rivalry with Turner and her ridiculous sayings that all left her as a somewhat fun character by the end. But let's get to Joseph, who is definitely one of the more likable figures on this season, seeming like a kind-hearted, genuine guy. But along with that comes him being pretty naive in the game and blindly loyal, and also making some very questionable strategic decisions, like creating the plan to backdoor himself and being too open with information with the fellow leftovers that left him as a pretty middling player in my eyes, especially when you consider the fact that he was also on the outs for the first few weeks and spent a lot of time being set up to be the first leftover to go anyways. And I really just did not find Joseph to be that good of a player on this season, though I do think he has potential. But I do think for his potential to actually be realized, he would need to not be blindly loyal to his alliance, which is such a fatal flaw for him, though I don't even know if he really has that cutthroat nature in him, as I think he just might be too kind-hearted for the game. But with that, let's jump to week 8, which ends up being a really surreal week, where the ups and downs of this week are just really insane, where the downfall of Kyle here is just on historic levels, with him coming into this week seemingly the best position to run the rest of the season, but ends up instead being taken out by his own closest ally, which again was just unbelievable to see all this occur here. But we do start off with the two groups coming back together, where we do see the Big Brochella group being shocked that Joseph was evicted, which does lead to disappointment from Taylor and Monty. But we do see the after party, the alliance made up of the remaining Dire Fest members, do really effective work here in putting the blame of everything really onto Joseph here, making him out to be this player that overplayed his hand on his way out and using the information he gave them against them here. But they do it in a way that felt a bit too coordinated, to where each person was pretty much giving the same stories that did make it come off as suspicious to the others. Though funnily, Taylor doesn't believe that Joseph would have ratted her out, as it makes no sense why he would do that, which she is right. It does make no sense why he would do that, but he did. So again, it is funny to see Taylor just being as confused as the audience was. But then we get to the HOH comp, which ends up being the tiny Veto Comp, but for HOH. But here we do see Turner win the HOH, and initially it did seem like the after party was going to run the show here. But Turner does actually have initial second thoughts, wanting to go back to the leftovers, which would have been a terrible move if he did, as the Michael, Brittany, Taylor contingent didn't have him in their endgame plans at this point, and considering he did have Terrence and Alyssa solidly working with him here, and if he did turn on them, they would have the information to easily rat him out for wanting to betray the leftovers. So if he did end up going back to leftovers, it did feel like it would have been a terrible move for Turner in this position, but along the way he does also end up promising everyone's safety, which was also terrible for him to do, with him essentially doing the same thing that he previously criticized Taylor for doing during her HOH. But Kyle ends up doing really effective work once again here and reeling Turner back in, getting him to stick with the after party, and they formulate a plan to backdoor Michael, with nominating Brittany and Taylor as pawns, and this seemingly put Kyle back in the driver's seat here, with him having flipped the game on Michael and Brittany, with him even being able to reform the pound along the way, with Monty coming back to their side as well, and they get him to agree to the Michael backdoor plan as well, after revealing to him the Joseph information that makes it clear to him that Michael, Brittany, and Taylor were already a trio. Again, feeling like this massive high for Kyle's game, with the Sunday night episode really portraying him as if he was this mastermind, only for us to immediately get his downfall the very following episode, feeling like a completely different week by that point. But we do start off the Wednesday night episode with Michael being a near consensus target, with the only way for Michael to stay during this week is if he's picked for the veto and he also ends up winning it. And what do you know? That is the exact situation that ends up occurring here, making Michael win his 5th ever veto, which ends up being slip and slide, which again traditionally is an HOH comp. But the fact that he beats Monty in this comp, someone that seems like the more ideal body type for this, is pretty impressive. With Michael now having the veto and obviously using it on Brittany, we do get some debate on who the replacement should be, with it initially settling on Monty, who by this point, his relationship with Kyle had already been a bit strained once again, with Kyle revealing to him the truth about what happened the previous week with him leaking the leftovers, which ends up pushing Monty away to where he started playing the middle again. But we do end up seeing some talk from Kyle and Alyssa about taking the shot at Monty in this position, making it seem like he was pretty likely to go home if he did touch the block. But this is where we do get the move that really shakes up the game here, where we do see Michael and Brittany talking about now not having anything to lose, and talk about needing Monty as a number, which, do they? But this leads to Michael and Brittany deciding that now is the time to reveal the Cookout 2.0 comments from Kyle, in order to try to get Kyle on the block, which I already talked about my opinions on the Kyle side of things, where again for me the big issue stems from him allowing this paranoia and his biases to affect how he plays the game, and a lot of the damage from those biases had already took effect on the game, with him already pushing away Monty and having already gotten rid of Joseph, which undeniably Kyle's actions are the worst in this entire situation, though I will also say that Michael and Brittany do not come off squeaky clean here either. Again, it does come off as a bit icky to me that they conveniently wait to use this information in a position where they are now safe after Michael had already won the veto, and in a position where it greatly benefits their game here, as using this information allows them to turn the entire house against Kyle, who did seem like the new frontrunner to really just run the game at this point. And for them to essentially weaponize racial biases, again, does feel icky here. But again, clearly not worse than the person that actually demonstrates those racial biases, which does make the edit of this entire situation kind of strange, with it really focusing more so on the Michael and Brittany side of it, making them come off as villainous for this move than it does for Kyle, making it seem like the producers were pissed at Michael and Brittany for making this move, as it again forced them to show this situation on the show, something again I think production wanted to avoid to protect their brand. But I do think that the revealing of this information being what led to Kyle's downfall here could be a major step in the right direction for the game moving forward in seasons to come. Where again, after having the cookout last season, where despite me understanding the cookout's purpose, I do feel like there's a major portion of the audience that still doesn't. And I did expect someone to try to counter that alliance coming into this season, and with us now seeing that Kyle tried to counter that, and it led to him being immediately booted once that was outed, this could be a good message for the future of the show, to where it will show that this behavior will not be tolerated. Though at the same time, I do think that the villainization of Michael and Brittany here does kind of propel the opposite message in saying that speaking out against this will lead to negative ramifications, which does seem to be a bit counterproductive there. But as a pure game move here, Michael and Brittany's move is a really effective one. While the context around it is icky, it is successful in tarnishing Kyle's name and ends up leading to his own number one ally being the one to backdoor him here, again making Turner do a move completely against his best interest. A historic move on paper, but one that in turn does have some major negatives to it, particularly in how this changes their reputations. For Michael in particular, considering Brittany was pretty dead in the water already, but here we do see that this move and the timing of it does end up bothering Monty and Terrence, to where they talk about not wanting to award them the win because of it. And it does open up the possibility of jurors being upset at how they use this information, to where while this move is great for short-term positioning, it does end up harming their long-term positioning of winning the game, especially considering the fact that they were already safe in this position anyway. And Michael was almost always going to be looked at as a big target moving forward due to his comp ability anyway, though technically it actually does work back around to where because of Michael's lower jury chances, it actually does give him a bit more runway moving forward, but again, that's something that Michael clearly couldn't have predicted there. And while he also couldn't have known this, but by seeing what ends up happening the following week with the comp results, it does make this move feel even more unnecessary, as more than likely he would have been able to get Kyle out during the following round unfettered anyway. So again, whether or not this was necessary from an in-game standpoint is still a question mark to me, though it undeniably was very effective in getting what they wanted for this particular round. But now to talk about how this all played out, where we do see Michael and Brittany decide to tell Monty and Taylor first, as they were the ones the most affected by this news, and here we do see Monty being genuinely hurt by this, and I do think seeing Monty's reactions to all this really just shows you how wrong Kyle's actions were here, where you do hear the clear disappointment in Monty's voice as he talks about this situation, with it surrounding this guy that he had fully trusted for a lot of the game. And for him to learn that the reason that his trust wasn't reciprocated was because of his race was a tough realization for him to have here. This conversation ends up giving Michael and Brittany the permission to go to Turner, where Michael ends up dumping this information on him, which Turner feels very icky about. However, the show does show this as Turner being very anti-Kyle off the bat, though technically at this point he actually still wanted Taylor gone. It wasn't until Kyle's later leaking of his game information that caused him to change his mind, but Turner does eventually agree to put Kyle on the block, making it all but guaranteed that Kyle was going home at that point, with the votes of Michael, Brittany, and Monty being enough already to take Kyle out, being such a fall from grace for Kyle, but one that did feel really satisfying as a comeuppance for his actions, and giving him a satisfying downfall from a storytelling standpoint as well, while also giving him this life lesson that he hopefully learns from moving forward. But this ends up being another Wednesday night episode that ends on a cliffhanger, with Kyle learning about the campaign against him, leading to him starting off in the denial phase, with him confronting Brittany about them twisting his words and making him out to be a racist. But then Kyle does seem to recognize the wrongs that he's done, and I will say that the edit did feel a bit strange on the Thursday night episode, with a lot of it focusing more so on Kyle and his redemption than it did on focusing on the minorities that were hurt by his actions, with us not getting to see as much of their point of views, which again did feel like a not ideal way to portray this. But we do end up seeing Kyle go on an apology tour, having these pretty powerful conversations with Monty and Taylor, where I was very impressed with how they handled these conversations, still holding him accountable, but still trying to genuinely teach him about his wrongdoings and showing them their point of views. Also, we do get the house meeting, which is again where it felt like the show focused more so on showing Michael and Brittany in a negative light, with Terrence confronting them about the timing of all this, and we do continue to see Monty being annoyed at them, which is kind of ironic considering this move actually did potentially save his game, and if not, did at least put him in a better position moving forward, where through this, he's essentially able to take Kyle's position in the opposing alliance, while also still having the connections to the Michael, Brittany, and Taylor side of things, making him a major frontrunner to win at this point in the game. Now also here we do end up seeing Kyle and Alyssa break up, which was just really awkward as Alyssa breaks up with him here, though they do end up continuing to hook up multiple times before he ends up leaving the house. So again, a lot of this just felt very pointless. And we still do actually get a formal eviction, which did also feel very weird to me, as this felt like a situation kind of similar to like the Jeff Farner situation, or maybe like the Tory vote out in Survivor 42, where it's like, did we need the vote? I feel like it's pretty obvious what's going to happen here. I felt like this was just wasted time that could have been spent on more of a focus on these conversations that Kyle had with Monty and Taylor that would have felt more appropriate to show here. But with that, we do lose Kyle, and Kyle is clearly one of the most complex figures on this season, having this controversial downfall here that even before that was probably still one of the most integral players into how the game was playing out up to this point, being part of the post pack earlier in the game and being the one to flip on that alliance after getting the information about Old School to create the leftovers, and then perfectly positioning himself within that alliance, only to blow up that position, both through his handling of his relationship with Alyssa and also his biases that left him mismanaging some of his relationships within the leftovers, and he ends up blowing up the leftovers in favor of the after party, and then proceeds to almost pull off this massive coup against Michael, only for Michael to flip the game back on him. And again, there are very impressive aspects of Kyle's game, though a lot of it does come immediately after a really negative aspect of his game. And because of that, it does lead to Kyle being a very difficult player to assess here, with him being a very, very active one, but one with very mixed results, having a downfall here fully stemmed by his own paranoia and biases that make him go out in an extremely sour note. But again, I do hope that Kyle learns from these experiences. I mean, it did seem like he was genuinely remorseful while he was leaving the house. He was apologetic for his actions, and hopefully afterwards he is able to use this experience to better himself and teach those that have similar biases to him. Though whether or not that goes through, we'll obviously have to wait to see. Now for week 9, another week that should have been really boring, and was boring for the first half of it. But we end up getting a lot of scrambling midway through that ends up being for naught by the end of the round, as everything just revolves back to what the dynamic started with at the beginning of the round. So again, that was kind of ridiculous, but still made this week interesting to watch despite not too much going on in terms of the dynamics for this one individual round. But we do start the round with a really short puzzle HOH comp that, despite most of it being shown on the Thursday night episode, we still couldn't get the result there because they need to waste time on the Sunday night episode. But Michael wins HOH here in a position where most of the house was already targeting him coming into the week, where we even surprisingly see the likes of Taylor talk about thinking about coming for him. But really the core gameplay here remains pretty stagnant in that Terrence and Alyssa end up being nominated here. The two non-former leftover members, with Terrence as the target, which never really changes. I mean, there was talk about Alyssa having some locked-in jury votes, and Monty in particular talked about wanting to keep Terrence around, with him spending a lot of the week talking to him where they bond over making misogynistic comments. But Terrence was going to be the clear boot across most of the week, and we do see Terrence talking about turning the jury against Michael because of him being upset over the Kyle situation, which was really humorous to see Terrence talk about how his game starts at jury and just his confidence that he would be able to turn the jury against Michael here, where while in the house he wasn't able to convince anyone of pretty much anything. But finally, like most other situations like this, Terrence's constant talk about tainting the jury actually helped Michael in his position moving forward in the round, with the likes of Monty thinking that this could harm Michael's jury chances, That leads to Monty even considering the situation of keeping Michael around. But beyond this, the true story of the week to me was really in what Michael was doing. Where, again, Michael is a player that I mostly agreed with his strategic decisions up to this point. But it really felt like he just lost the plot during this week. Now his refusal to target Turner does seem to stem from the promise he made to him after the Kyle situation. And by breaking that, I do think it would have been an even worse look for him, both from an in-game position, but also in just real life. And I can understand why he doesn't go through with that, but it was definitely the suboptimal play. And for him to not even target Monty in this position either just felt like such a massive misstep to me. Where coming into this round, Michael already knew that Monty and Turner were coming for him. And while he was in a position where either him or Brittany needed to win out moving forward anyway, keeping both Monty and Turner, who are working in lockstep at this point, and are two much bigger comp threats in the game here, especially over the likes of Alyssa and Terrence, just seems so misguided to me from a game position, as it definitely makes his path to winning out a lot more difficult. It also just makes his path to navigate the game strategically beyond this more difficult. And I do think a lot of that comes from Michael also not seeming to fully commit to him needing to win out here. I do think he still held on to hope that with him having Brittany on his side and potentially Taylor, and him having loose agreements with Turner and Monty, that he wouldn't need to win out. But I do feel like from his position, he should have 100% known that winning out was pretty much the only option. And for him to not optimize that path was a misstep to me. But also to go along with that, the big shift across this week, what causes all this chaos and what should have been a boring week, was all this work that was put in by Brittany, where she decides to cause a ruckus in order to protect herself and also Michael, and was successful in securing Michael's position in the game for a few days. But by the end of this round, it didn't stay in place. And I do think this is another criticism of Michael, and the fact that he doesn't do anything to help keep that in place, which to me is the most damaging aspect of this final week for him here, where had he just helped Brittany maintain Monty and Turner instead of just brushing her off as he looked at her just getting paranoid once again, I do think Michael could have likely kept things in place to where coming into the double, Monty and Turner may not have come for him. But again, I do think Brittany does do good work across this week in getting what she wants done, again, for a bit. The problem is, one, that work that she is doing is to benefit Michael more so than it is herself, where while it does keep her safe, she decreases the chances of her winning the game, though to be fair, not much of a chance to begin with. But also here, the fact that she gets caught in playing both sides by the end of the week is also a negative here. But I do find it interesting the way that Brittany ends up playing the game at this point, where she is aware to the fact that her jury chances are very, very minimal. And instead of playing like what most people would do and trying to get to the end in a way that would lead to their win, Brittany knows that that's not likely. So she instead plays towards her next best case scenario, which is to get second place, but also to get second place to Michael. And we do see her start the week in this position of her being the backup target in the case that Michael wins the veto, and she does do work in making final twos with Turner and Alyssa across the week. We see her be part of this final three that the women form, and she just ends up playing extremely hard here, because what does she have to lose at this point? She's more than likely not going to win anyway. But the interesting part of all this is her leaking this information to Turner about the women coming together, which ends up making Turner and Monty reconsider targeting Michael, under the fear that once he goes, the women will come after them. And this ends up being really effective in changing their minds and making them want to come for the women at this point instead of Michael. And we do see the three guys form a gentleman's agreement to not go after each other. And it did seem like Turner and Monty were fully buying into this at first, saying to the cameras and to the DRs that they did plan on going towards the end of the game with Michael. But again, all of this ends up backfiring on Brittany eventually, with Alyssa and Taylor getting word of Brittany's leaking of the information, upsetting them, and now making the guys know moving forward that the women aren't actually working together. Which again, just all this blows up in Brittany's face, but it blows up to where she's just in the same position she was to begin with. And again, people talk about how terribly she was playing across this week, when in reality, what she did was effective for a few days. And I do think if Michael had helped her out in this position, I do think they would have been able to maintain that position long enough to get through to double. But again, once everything unravels, she's just put back in the same spot she was at the beginning of the week. She's still the secondary target in the case that Michael wins the veto, and still has no chance of winning a jury vote. So again, it's like, while she is, yes, in a bad position to win the game, she was never in a good position to win the game. So for me, I do at least respect that she at least tried to do something here, though it doesn't end up fully going through. And really, she does end up doing so much more to help Michael's game across this week than Michael does for himself, where she does campaign for him to Taylor, trying to convince her to stick with the final 3 deal. We see her trying to convince Michael to go for Monty and Turner, which would have been his optimal move, but to no avail. So again, it was very frustrating to see Michael not do anything to help himself across this week. And the only bright spots from this week were due to Brittany's work and him really just lucking his way into safety that he ends up getting backed out of by the end of the week anyway. Now, also during this week, we do get the return of Zingbot, which ends up being another unfunny appearance that really makes you question why they bother with Zingbot nowadays, considering how lazy the jokes are. And the same thing goes for BB Comics, which we get this week as well, where we get some really lazy ones like Abira and Melissa. Though I will say there were a couple decent ones like Taylor's and Jasmine's. Isles mentioned him having reptile dysfunction, which was funny. But here we do see Michael winning his 6th veto of the season, breaking the all-time veto record and tying Janelle's all-time comp win record, which has stood since All-Stars 1, which was a very impressive feat here. But with his eventual loss in the next veto, he ends up bizarrely ending up with the exact same comp percentage as Janelle, and also the exact same DR count. So the Janelle parallels of Michael here are really eerie, but again, Michael doesn't use the veto in this position, and there wasn't really much hope for Terrence to stay, despite how much of a non-threat he seemed to be in the endgame here, and he ends up being voted out unanimously, with him storming off without saying goodbye, saying that he's doing a Daniel, which is something you should never want to mirror. But with that, let's talk about Terrence, who I remember coming into the season, I was expecting him to be this jovial, older guy figure, but instead, he ends up being one of the more toxic figures across this season, continuing to be this very anti-Taylor figure, even up until his eviction week here, and making misogynistic comments along the way that really just made him straight up unlikable. And to go along with that, he was just such a mediocre player as well, to where I don't think he would really even have a sliver of a chance against anybody at the end except for maybe Brittany, and even then I don't think he would get the win there. And he ends up being another one of these figures that really just didn't bring much entertainment to the show, while also just not doing much in the game either. But the week doesn't end here, as this is where we also get the formal double eviction, with this one ending up being a pretty strong one, largely due to the fall of Michael here and all of his antics along the way. Now, I will say that on the show, this wasn't properly set up, as the last thing we saw from the house was Monty and Turner wanting to go to 3 with Michael. But again, after that on the feeds, with the women clearly not working together, we do see Monty in particular talk about needing to take the shot at Michael once again. Though this was spurred on by a conversation he had with Taylor, to where she reminds him that he has no reason to not go for Michael if he has the opportunity now. And I know this did lead to some debate over who deserves the credit for the upcoming move, and realistically, I think it's both. I mean, Monty was the one to initially put in the work with Taylor to get her flip against Michael, though it is obviously her that eventually convinces him back towards that plan after he deviates away from it. However, I do think I would lean towards giving Monty more of the credit here. I mean, Monty is the one that makes the move in a way that the jury would recognize that this is his move, with his work being more obvious to them than Taylor's here. But also, we see Turner not being as solid on this plan, to the point where we do see Monty having to convince him to go along with it, which is where, again, I do think that gives the edge a bit more to Monty, where the reason why this move even comes to be is because of Monty's influence over Turner, which ends up sealing the deal here. But as for the actual events of the double, we do come into it with pretty much everybody but Brittany targeting Michael here, and while Brittany does get tied for second with Monty in the HOH, it does turn out to be Turner who wins the comp. And initially he nominates Brittany and Alyssa, with Brittany seeming to be his target off the bat, where again, it didn't seem like he was that confident in the Michael backdoor plan. But once Monty ends up winning the veto, it does seem like he is the one to convince Turner to go along with it. Now, the veto itself was pretty riveting to watch, with it being do or die for Michael here, and we do see him make multiple attempts for the win just to be short each time, and instantly with Monty winning here, we do see him telling Alyssa that she's coming down, and we see him tell Turner what he needs to do, which was a really fun comeuppance for Michael, with him being taken out by the two guys that he refused to target in the previous round, and for Monty to be the main figure here, a guy that Michael had considered taking out during each of his HOH reigns, and for that guy to be the one that leads to his downfall here was pretty fitting. But again, along the way, we do get some solid content from Michael on his way out, where even after Monty uses the veto, before Turner gets to say his replacement, we do see Michael pleading to keep himself off the block. We do see him campaign as we come back from the commercial, and we see him give this really fun speech where he campaigns to Alyssa and Taylor and talks about Brittany's messy gameplay right in front of Brittany, to where we get some great reactions from her, with her being aghast that Michael would campaign against her. And that was super humorous to see, along with the fact that Michael also storms out of the house saying that there was something he would like to say, only for him to walk out mid-sentence, which again, all this was really fun, being a really notable exit from my point of view. Now, I know there are people that are upset at how bitter he came off, but again, I still found it really fun. And with that, let's talk about Michael, who obviously makes a massive impact on this season, winning a ridiculous amount of comps and being one of the pillars of strategy on this season, where I do think him and Kyle were the two most active players throughout most of the game that did dictate how the game played out. And while there was obviously the ickiness around the Kyle situation that is a bit of a taint on Michael's legacy here, I do feel like outside of that, he is still one of the most notable figures on this season. Despite his negative portrayal at points towards the end here, I do feel like he is still one of the most likely returnees from this cast moving forward. Now, while I do think he got a satisfying downfall here from a narrative perspective, with him being taken out by a guy that he thought about taking out in the past but never actually did, I am still a bit disappointed that he didn't quite break the record for most comps won. I do think the most satisfying downfall for him, from my point of view, would have been if he were to break the record, win his way all the way to Final 3, only to fall short in that final competition. But either way, I do still find him to be one of the better players on this season. Again, strategically, I do think he is the person that's the most in line with the way that I think about the game, though I do think he is a bit middling socially, and even strategically can be a bit passive at points. With that being a lot of the impetus of how much he misplayed his last week in the game, though at the same time I do think he is someone that was a bit harmed by how the split house twist played out, where that ratted out his game a bit, though considering how many comps he had won, obviously the target on his back was growing the further he got into the game, though again, I still think he is a pretty solid player here, and probably the person on this cast I would have the most confidence in if he were to return to the game. And now for week 10, the final 5 round, which should have been a really boring round as it typically is, but somehow this ends up being another pretty crazy week, especially from a feeds perspective, which I don't feel like got properly portrayed on the show, as a lot of the more interesting aspects of this week were relegated to the segment right before the eviction. Instead, we got just so much filler on the actual show itself. But here we do see Brittany mourn the loss of Michael and feeling betrayed by him. But through his departure, Brittany ends up being pretty isolated across this week, where despite her being a well-known goat in the house, Taylor's really the only person here that actually planned on taking her to the end at this point. But also with Taylor spending more time with the likes of Monty across this week, Brittany herself starts to lose trust in Taylor despite her being the only one loyal to her, which was a humorous aspect of all this. But here we do see Monty win the HOH in a position where he is now perfectly set up as the front runner in the game here, getting the credit for the Michael boot, him having a final 2 with Turner, a final 2 with Taylor as well. He ends up making a final 3 with Turner and Taylor that ends up being a perfect scenario for him and gives him a very straightforward path moving forward, especially with Turner seeming to be looked at as the bigger threat in-game, despite the fact that that's not the way the jury perceived the game at this point. So, I mean, this really was a perfect position for Monty, and I do think he played most of this week optimally, where he does nominate Brittany and Alyssa, with Alyssa actually being his target, a perfect target for him as a person closer to Turner than to him, which in turn means that taking her out here is taking out a person that's directly coming for him in the following round, while also isolating Turner and keeping him around as a shield for the following round, with both Taylor and Brittany at this point wanting Turner gone over him, and also still having Turner as a person that's planning on taking him to the end, so Monty was in a really strong position here at the start. But across this week, we do see some holes start to emerge. One in the fact that he does some really terrible jury management with Brittany here, calling her out for her lies, and ironically using the same tactics on her that Brittany had previously used on Jasmine during her boot week, where blaming her and condemning the way that she's playing the game and making it clear that it's her fault that she's going home, while at the same time just calling her out for things that they themselves are doing, which again is just a terrible look, but also makes it clear to Brittany here that Monty is against her, to where now she considers taking him out instead of Turner moving forward, and also talks about not wanting to vote for him at the end either. But also here we see Monty's bond with Taylor further solidify, with them starting to hook up, which was really humorous to see BB Twitter erupt over this. And it was really abnormal to see a showman start this late into a season, but this could have easily put a further target on Taylor's back if this was found out, to which, if Taylor did end up going home across this week, it would have been very detrimental to Monty's positioning moving forward. But even beyond that, the bond between these two increased the likelihood of Monty now taking her to the end instead of Turner, making that actually seem more likely at this point, which is a pretty suboptimal move from the outside point of view, knowing that certain jury members that were anti-Taylor have now become pro-Taylor, to which the jury vote between them seemed to be pretty close, which is where I should mention I do think a great factor into Taylor's jury chances, particularly with the likes of an Indy and a Jasmine who were very anti-Taylor throughout a lot of the season, did seem to stem from exit interviews where, through them constantly being asked about the treatment of Taylor and the things that they said about her, it did allow them to gauge how liked Taylor was on the outside and how they were being perceived, to where I do think that played a major factor in them wanting to now vote for Taylor at the end, which seemed to greatly increase her win equity here. But it's also something that the players inside of the house could have never really gauged, as again, that's all coming from external information. But through this outcome now looking like a possibility, it did leave Monty looking a bit less likely to win than he was coming into his HOH. But we do see him playing both sides here, telling both Turner and Taylor pretty much the same thing, with each of them wanting to target the other at the beginning of the week, while obviously still intending on taking both of them to the end of the game here. But on the show, Taylor in particular gets a lot of content about wanting to target Turner here and wanting to win the veto in order to take him out. But instead, the worst case scenario for her happens here, where Brittany wins the veto, in a position where Monty wasn't allowed to play because he didn't get to the backyard in time, which was ridiculous that this was even a rule for a final 5 veto competition. But with Brittany winning the veto here, we do have Monty having to make a difficult decision where he is now forced to put up one of his final 2s. And again, I do think he makes the right choice here in putting up Taylor, one as a way to protect Turner, who is a shield for him, while also taking away the opportunity for Taylor and Brittany to flip the vote onto him. While also, by doing this, he's able to show more of his influence over Turner by making Turner agree to vote out Alyssa, which is a move that makes absolutely no sense for him to do here. Getting rid of his own number while keeping Taylor in the game, someone who still wants him out moving forward, while also lessening his jury chances by keeping in both Monty and Taylor, who seemed to be more respected by the jury, and also having some terrible jury management with Alyssa across this week, with his constant lying to her about wanting to keep her, unnecessarily lying to her until the very end, and ends up being the sole reason why she ends up going home here. So all this was really bad from him, but really out of nowhere, the true chaos of this week does stem from Brittany, who, feeling neglected by Taylor with her stopping spending time with her in order to spend more time with Monty, which, to be fair, is a poor play from Taylor's end, but here, because of that, we do see Brittany deciding to flip the vote onto Taylor, which, does show you how emotional of a player Brittany was being here, though funnily, through Brittany now wanting to keep Alyssa, she's actually making her optimal move here if she wants to win the game at least, where Alyssa is the only person in the game at this point that she would have a sliver of a chance of beating at the end, but again, that's not the reason why she decides to make the move here. And even beyond that, Brittany seemed mostly resolute in the fact that she wasn't going to win and that she just wanted second place at this point, and by making this move and in turn failing at it could have only caused a bigger rift between her and Taylor, in a position where again Taylor's the only person that actually wants to take her to the end here. And through Taylor staying in the game beyond this definitely could have severed that possibility as well, making this a pretty misguided plan based on Brittany's current approach to the game of just wanting to get to the final two. But funnily, it actually is the best move for her if she wanted to still try to win the game. But either way, it ends up falling through, though from a feed's perspective, to see this shift here and to see Turner's intentions being a bit hazy, it did lead to an interesting back half of the week here, where it did feel like there was at least a chance of Taylor somehow going home here, with Brittany and Alyssa coming up with this plan to get Turner to throw a sympathy vote and blindside Taylor that way, which would have been a ridiculous conclusion to Taylor's arc across this season, but none of that ends up going through, and we just have a tie where Monty does end up voting out Alyssa. And with that, let's talk about Alyssa, who ends up being the typical young, attractive girl that is on every season of Big Brother, who wants to get in a showmance and does, and really doesn't do much else, which I do think is a shame, as I don't think Alyssa's the worst player in the world, especially if she were able to play again. I do think with more life experience, she could actually be a pretty solid player. But she did spend a lot of this season really aloof at what was going on, while also still being the catalyst for most of the game. She is the reason the leftovers came together through her leaking of info to Kyle. She is the reason why they split, also through her relationship with Kyle. She was also in the center of the power structure early on in the game through her relationships with Paloma and Amira. She technically plays a major factor on this season, despite her not really doing much for most of the game, and through that mostly comes out of this season as a non-factor, outside of obviously her relationship with Kyle. Now for week 11, the final 4 round, which for some reason is still a full week. And what makes it even more dreadful is the fact that we have the Veto Comp really early on in the week, to where there's really just nothing going on for most of the week, as the result was pretty much already decided. But here we do see Taylor winning HOH, leaving us in a position where Brittany was almost guaranteed to go home here, with both Monty and Turner wanting her out, meaning that the only way she doesn't go home is if she's not on the block by the end of the week. And we do see Monty winning the veto, which just sealed her fate. Again, really early on in the week, where despite Brittany's constant campaigning and Taylor trying to put in some good work for her as well, Monty never wavered, as he really shouldn't, as on paper, this guarantees him a spot in the final 2, with both Taylor and Turner planning on taking him to the end at this point. So again, this really made this week boring from a game front. And again, really nothing was going on here, where even on the show focuses so much on Taylor wanting to find out who voted for her in the previous round, which really just did not matter. Though we do get a humorous interaction between Brittany and Turner here, where he wants to confront her over the vote, but she just deadpans, turns him down. Well, this leads to them acting as if the nominations really matter here, which we all know that they don't. The Veto Comp also ends up having some humor to it, where really just everyone sucked at it, and considering how much Monty brags after the fact about how great he is at math and that being why he won, it was humorous to see that he was actually the only one to mess up the math portion of the competition. But also here we do see some ickiness across this week from the breakdown of the Monty-Taylor relationship, with Monty getting insulted by a joke that Taylor made about him missing time with his goddaughter, and also pulling off the headphones while he was sleeping, and this proceeds to him essentially breaking up with her and moving his things out of the HOH room, which all just seemed really petty. But really the worst of it is the fact that he also brings in the mistreatment of Taylor from early on in the game as a way to justify his actions here, and once again blames her and this narrative that was built of her being this cold person as evidence that she just needs to treat people better. And again, this just felt like him masking his own insecurities, where again, the things that Taylor did here again certainly can annoy a person, but at the end of the day, they are pretty minor, and to go to the lengths that Monty does here over these things really just seemed pretty petulant, and did lead to him coming off as really misogynistic here as well, with him seeming to be upset at Taylor for not catering to the way that he wanted her to be acting. But even beyond this being a bad look for Monty from an outside standpoint, this is also just really bad for his game, where through this he pushes Taylor away to where she considers cutting him at 3 more so, and through his relationship with Taylor and him being non-committal to Turner, it does also further distance Turner from him as well, which did leave some room open, this potentially not being as great of a spot for him as it was set up to be initially. Though, realistically, still better than the route with Brittany, as that would mean he would absolutely need to win final HOH, instead of the route that he takes, where at least there he does have a lot more options. And through that, again, no suspense leading up to the Brittany boot. But Brittany ends up being an interesting figure across this season, being a pretty self-aware player in her recognizing that she would struggle to win a jury vote from pretty early on, and instead ends up playing not to win at that point, but more so to give the person that she wants to win the win, in that being Michael, but also actively playing for second place. And also ends up playing pretty aggressively moving forward, knowing that worst comes to worst, she loses the game, which was going to happen anyway. So I did find Brittany's game philosophy really interesting here, which did lead to her playing this chaotic and messy game, but one that did lead to certain rounds, like the final 7 and final 5 rounds, that should have been really boring, way more interesting than they had any right to be. And I did find Brittany to also be a fun character along the way, with a fun cadence and a fun energy, while mixing that in with her being the messy player that she is did lead to her bring some entertainment on this season. But now for the final 3 round, which coming into it did seem set up for Monty and Taylor to take each other, which was the suboptimal move for both of them, while Turner, who seemed like a GOAT at this point, needed to win the final HOH to get his way to the end, but right away we do get some intrigue from Turner winning part 1, and then proceeding to actually start the study for the final part, something he hadn't done the entire season. And because that, it actually made it seem like Turner could have probably turned this around, where he was completely doomed coming into the round, even if he got to part 3. But with the fact that the final HOH recently has become a series of really easy days questions, this did give Turner a bit of a shot here. But really, even if it did happen, Turner winning HOH here felt like one of the more underwhelming outcomes to this season, as that would just lead to an easy Monty win. While obviously the Taylor-Monty situation opens up Taylor winning, which obviously is an incredible story, but also just had a lot more intrigue in how the jury was going to vote, where Monty and Taylor coming into this seem like the 2 biggest jury threats on the board, and it is extremely rare to see that type of final 2. And here we do see Monty winning part 2 and proceeding to still beat Turner in the final HOH, giving him the big decision between essentially a guaranteed win or a very rocky jury vote, which we later find out to be a loss, which funnily to him, he didn't see it that way. Instead, he saw it the complete opposite, which again comes back to this in-game perception of Turner, that they thought that he was getting the credit for these moves that he wasn't getting credit for, but also just shows Monty's complete misread on Taylor. And through that, this does end up being a very satisfying downfall for Monty to see these misconceptions about Taylor coming up once again, but this time it being the reason that she ends up winning the game, and was really great from the aspect of it was Monty making this decision. This guy who had just demeaned her and ridiculed her throughout the last few weeks, and for him to be guided by his own misconception that Taylor can't win the game, and that causing his downfall was such a great storyline for him as well. So obviously we do end up seeing him make the mistake of voting out Turner here. And Turner is a fascinating player across this season, having massive highs and lows, but a lot of that really stemmed from the fact that Turner was just an extremely passive and moldable presence, where he starts off extremely passive and was supposed to be the target week 3 and had to be forced to backdoor Amira and join the leftovers, which despite that greatly benefiting his game, it was something that he was too scared to do and had to be strong-armed into doing it. Same goes for flipping against the leftovers and sticking with the after party and taking out Michael, like all these things that did end up benefiting his game, but he had to be manipulated by someone else in order to do so. And I think that really culminated in him being convinced to vote out Alyssa, which ends up being a astronomically bad move, essentially guaranteeing his loss moving forward, and really just ends up being a largely mediocre player in my eyes due to his lack of active play. Though I did still find him to be a humorous figure on the show, particularly with his rivalry with Jasmine, though outside of that it was just mostly a middling figure to watch. But then we get to the final two of Monty versus Taylor, and right away, seeing the jury's reactions and seeing how Michael in particular mentions how Taylor would find a way to get Monty to take her to the end, it really felt like a shut case here. But to go along with that, we do see Monty give a pretty mediocre performance, with him talking about how he played an honest and truthful game, which, again, being on such a high horse is just such a classic mistake here, and keeps on talking about taking out Turner was his best move, when in reality it was his worst, and it was just an even worse look to the jury there. And to follow that up with Taylor's really incredible performance, her gracious answers to every question, and her really incredible final speech, really summing up the season in such a perfect way. And we get this great moment of her saying, "I'm not a shield, I'm a sword." And we see the reaction from Joseph, who is the person who gave her that line earlier in the season. She says, "I'm not a victim, I'm a victor." Again, these incredible lines that really make her performance here an all-time great one. She talks about her resilience. She plays it up to the women. She talks about how her win would be abnormal to the likes of Monty. And like, all these things are so perfect. It really was an all-time great speech. Though I will say, I don't think it mattered. I think realistically, I think the jury was already voting for Taylor. I think she already had the win, but obviously this further solidifies it. And I will say, I was actually shocked to see that it was only Turner that voted for Monty, where we do see both the likes of Kyle and Terrence voting for Taylor here, something that was just mind-blowing to me, especially from Terrence. So we do end up seeing Taylor win in an 8-1 vote, which is just, again, such a great storybook ending for the season. And with her also winning AFP as well, becoming the first winner to do so, which, I mean, I'll say, I think that's more so because of production not allowing people like Ian to be a winner in the past. But either way, great outcome to the season, providing this really massive downfall for Monty, while also giving us this incredible story of Taylor being this historic winner, being the first ever black woman to win the game, being the winner who had watched the least amount of Big Brother ever since Hayden Moss, also winning the least amount of competitions out of any recent winner. She's the winner that survived the block the most amount of times. Along with that, she's also the first and only winner since Maggie to not play in the final part of the HOH. And I do think, again, that this win can change the way that people look at the game moving forward, not focusing on the numbers of competitions you won, which has become such a focus of modern Big Brother. And with us seeing Monty, the prototypical modern Big Brother winner, losing in a jury vote here. And something else that's just so special about all this is the fact that she did it on the 20-year anniversary, to the day of when Daniel Reyes lost in Big Brother 3, in a position where Daniel only got one vote. Here, Taylor got all but one vote. And I do think that is something that just adds to the storybook nature of all of this. Well, now let's wrap up the review by talking about the final two, starting off with Monty, who again is a player very similar to the likes of the last four winners of BBUS. And straight up, I do think Monty played the better game, for whatever that means, of the two. And I personally would have voted for Monty in the final two if I'm basing it off of gameplay. But the fact that he doesn't win the game here really just shows you his lack of awareness of his own game and how other people perceived his game. I will say it would have been difficult for him to read that Taylor would have had such support, considering it seemed like a lot of that support did come from after the jurors had already left the house. But his move to vote out Turner here does end up becoming one of the all-time worst moves in the history of Big Brother for me, feeling like a move very similar to the likes of Josh that we just saw in BB Can 10, where Monty essentially votes out his best friend to take the person that he perceives as the GOAT, only to then lose to that GOAT. But again, before that, I will still say, again, I do think Monty played the best game of the final three here. He was in the best position of this final three early on and was the most integral to the actual formation of the leftovers. But following that, he did become a big target that was targeted by the other side of the house, and in turn started to play a lot more passively up until the Kyle eviction week, which was a week where he largely gets saved due to the exposing of Kyle, which again had nothing to do with what he actually did in the game. Where again, he was about to get backdoored there with a serious chance of being voted out. Though again, I still would largely credit him for the Michael move. But even that's something that he didn't even decide to actually go through with until the very last second. Monty played a very fine game of Big Brother. I mean, if he had won, he would have been around the likes of an Xavier or a Casey for me. But due to the fact that he falls short here, I think that really just shows you a lot of the downsides of him as a player. And as a figure in the house, I really just found him boring. He didn't bring much entertainment to the show to me. His treatment of Taylor, especially in the tail end of the season, was just extremely icky, despite the fact that they were in a showmance. And all that obviously makes him a really unlikable presence there, and again, I was completely fine seeing him lose here. But then we get to Taylor, the winner of the season, my third correct winner pick for BBUS in a row, which is just insane, but Again, I already said it. It's a historic win here. I mean, I know her win means a lot to a lot of people out there, and it's the type of win that we don't typically see on Big Brother, while also being an incredible story to bat. Now, again, from a game perspective, I do find her game mostly middling. I mean, obviously she had a lot of disadvantages across the season due to the biases that were held against her early on in the game, and was playing in self-preservation mode for most of those early weeks. And even after the creation of the leftovers, she still had to pretend like she was on the outs, which made her experience here just radically different from most other players that play Big Brother. But the fact that she was able to persevere beyond that and win back all the people that hated her in the early portions of the game is definitely an incredible attribute of her as a person, which really shined through when it comes down to them giving her their jury votes. Again, did Taylor have the most control in the game, or really had any dictation over how the game played out? No. She was saved week 1 in a position where she was going to get voted out, and even though, yes, I know that she would have survived due to the backstage twist, that still means that she would have been saved by a twist. So I do think that is something to factor in when assessing her game, especially for something like a winner ranking. But again, a lot of that is just perpetuated by these biases that were held against her from the very beginning. And beyond that, considering where she started, she does end up playing a very impressive game, especially utilizing these disadvantages and weaponizing them to get Monty to take her to the end and win over him in a jury vote is definitely a feat to be commended here. And while I don't think, again, she is the best player in the world or really anything close, I mean, in this season filled with very mediocre players and really not a single great player in sight, I really don't have an issue with the fact that the person that I don't think played the best game ended up winning the game here. Because really, at the end of the day, it's not even by that big of a margin. And even then, I think this was still just such an incredible story to watch. And to see the show of Big Brother tell this type of story was definitely a very satisfying outcome for the season, and definitely is something that is going to make this season stand out by the end of it. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire season of Big Brother 24, a really wild season, a season that had so many twists and turns, and mixing that in with its really satisfying outcome, I do think the season ends up becoming one of the best modern Big Brother seasons. Probably my second favorite season out of the last 6. It feels like a season that's getting Big Brother out of this massive dry spot that it's been in for the last few years. Now, I still do reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video. I do still stand by the fact that I did feel a bit disconnected from the season for a lot of it. I still did not connect with this cast. And really, outside of Taylor winning, the formation of the leftovers, and Michael's eviction, I do feel like a lot of this season has a negative taint surrounding it, largely due to the mistreatment of Taylor. That was obviously a massive presence throughout really the entire season. And mixing that in with the Kyle situation as well, and also all the negativity surrounding the split house week, and also, again, just having a mostly unlikable cast, it does leave me with very mixed opinions on this season. Now, I will say again, the win from Taylor really rectifies a lot of those issues to where I do think the further away I get from this season, the more positive I'm going to feel, as I'm going to kind of forget about the more negative aspects. But I think with us being so close to it, those things are still prevalent in my mind, to where as of right now, I would probably land it around the middle of my season ranking, but I definitely think there's room for it to potentially go up. But I mean, there we go. I mean, that is my review of Big Brother 24. Now, like most other seasons that I cover, I will be doing a player ranking for the season to wrap up my coverage of the season, so stay tuned for that. I'm obviously going to cover Survivor 43 and The Amazing Race 34 that are currently going on as well. And also before BB25, there are a few bigger Big Brother rankings I would like to do. Things like a first boot ranking, a cast ranking, pre-jury ranking, post-jury ranking of the first weeks. Like, those are all ideas that I have for bigger rankings at some point across the next year, so stay tuned for those as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.